Thank you. Good morning. Bonjour. Good morning. Bonjour. I know we're few, but we have the energy. Good morning. We're so happy to have you with us today. And it's a privilege to be here speaking to you as well and hosting this event. Those joining us from online, good morning as well. And thanks a lot for joining us. And we are extremely excited to have you. On behalf of Africatalyst, SIA, the South African Institute of International Affairs, the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and UNDP, we are delighted to welcome you to this dialogue under the theme Empowering Africa's Voice within the G20. There is no better time than now to talk about Africa's unified voice, not just within the G20, but also beyond and sustaining the momentum. I had so much to say, but due to the interest of time, I'm going to cut it short. And I'll say this, that our hope today is that the conversations, the dialogue and exchanges we have will help us catalyze our collective imagination and new ideas as we engage deeply and explore how Africa can strengthen its presence and effectiveness in global decision-making spaces. We're talking about G20, we're talking about COP, which is upcoming in just a few weeks, but also financing for development and other platforms. Also to note that we're live streaming on Africatalyst website and YouTube channels. And again, we will be expecting other participants who will be joining in due course of this dialogue. But to help me kick off this, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jibril John, Coordinator, Directorate General of Planning and Economic Policy in the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Cooperation from the Republic of Senegal. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un plaisir pour nous d'avoir l'honneur de représenter les autorités à cette importante rencontre. Nous allons juste essayer de livrer le message des autorités en guise d'ouverture de ces 2 jours de travaux. Excellence, autorité en vos rangs et qualités, mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, c'est pour nous vraiment un grand honneur et un immense privilège de vous souhaiter aujourd'hui la bienvenue à Dakar. En wolof, on dirait yegsi leen ak jàmm, dal leen ak jàmm. Je pense que il faudra retenir ça une bonne fois pour toutes et de vous transmettre surtout les salutations les plus chaleureuses des autorités sénégalaises, du gouvernement du Sénégal et du peuple sénégalais. Nous sommes profondément honorés d'accueillir en ces lieux cette illustre assemblée de dirigeants, d'experts et de partenaires venus de l'ensemble du continent africain et d'ailleurs, réunis à cette occasion par la volonté commune de contribuer à l'avancement des aspirations de développement de l'Afrique. La présente conférence, intitulée « Renforcer la voix de l'Afrique au sein du G20 », se tient à un moment charnière pour notre continent et pour le développement mondial. L'accession de l'Union africaine au statut de membre permanent du G20 confère à l'Afrique une voix collective sans précédent sur la scène internationale. Cette évolution historique nous offre l'opportunité d'assurer que les priorités du continent demeurent au cœur des décisions globales. Comme illustration majeure en matière de ces priorités, nous pouvons citer le développement durable, la soutenabilité de la dette, la résilience climatique et surtout la croissance inclusive. Sous la présidence sud-africaine du G20, l'attention portée à l'agenda de développement du Sud s'est trouvée revitalisée. Le Sénégal salue ses efforts et réaffirme son engagement indéfectible à promouvoir la vision africaine d'une prospérité partagée, fondée sur une coordination renforcée, des partenariats approfondis et une participation active et continue dans le processus du G20. À l'ouverture des travaux, mesdames et messieurs, de ces 2 journées de travaux, je vous encourage à dialoguer en toute sincérité, à faire preuve d'une écoute attentive et à unir nos efforts pour parvenir à des résultats à la fois concrets et durables. Les échanges et réflexions qui seront issus de ces 2 jours de travaux à Dakar contribueront certainement à enrichir la position commune du continent en vue du prochain sommet du G20 qui viendra, in fine, couronner la présidence historique de l'Afrique du Sud. Donc, c'est encore une fois au nom du gouvernement, du ministère de l'économie, du plan et de la coopération, que je formule le souhait que cette conférence soit à la fois enrichissante pour tous, fructueuse en matière de résultats, mais surtout soit une inspiration pour toutes les parties prenantes. Nous souhaitons également qu'elle soit l'occasion de contribuer au renforcement de la place et surtout de l'influence de l'Afrique dans la gouvernance économique mondiale. Je vous remercie par ces mots, par ces souhaits, de votre aimable attention et renouvelle au nom de l'État du Sénégal, du gouvernement et du peuple sénégalais la cordiale bienvenue à Dakar. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Jibril, and for your opening welcome remarks and welcoming us to Dakar, Jeff. Now, to help us set the stage for the day, I would like you to join me in welcoming our principals and partners who have also made our gathering here today possible, starting with Dr. Dauda Sembène, the CEO and President of Africa Catalyst.
Merci beaucoup, Maggie. Bonjour, Excellence, Monsieur le représentant du ministre de l'économie, de la coopération et du plan. Honorables invités, Catherine, la présidente de l'Institut sud-africain des affaires internationales, Madame la représentante du Programme des Nations Unies pour le développement, Et nous avons, je pense, aussi en ligne monsieur le représentant de l'Agence de l'Union africaine pour le développement, le NEPAD. Mesdames et messieurs, à vos rangs et grades respectifs, Dalen Arjam au Sénégal. Comme on dit chez nous, bienvenue au Sénégal, le pays de la Teranga. C'est un honneur en tant que président du cabinet Africataliste, un cabinet de droit sénégalais établi ici à Dakar, de nous joindre à l'Institut sud-africain des affaires internationales, SAIA, au Programme des Nations Unies pour le développement, à l'Agence de développement de l'Union africaine NEPAD, pour organiser cette conférence régionale sur le G20. Je pense que vous le savez tous, l'Afrique du Sud assume en ce moment la présidence du G20 pour cette année. Et c'est une présidence extrêmement importante en ce sens que c'est une belle opportunité pour le Sud global, mais aussi pour le continent africain, de s'assurer que leurs priorités sont reflétées dans l'agenda du G20. Et cette présidence fait suite à la présidence qui a été assumée par 2 autres pays du Sud global, en l'occurrence l'Inde et le Brésil, qui ont précédé l'Afrique du Sud il y a 2 ans et qui ont aussi œuvré pour que les priorités de nos pays, les pays en développement et les pays émergents, soient bien reflétées sur l'agenda du G20. Vous le savez également, en fait, depuis quelque temps, l'Union africaine a obtenu un siège de représentant permanent au niveau du G20, ce qui ajoute encore beaucoup plus, en fait, à la voix de l'Afrique dans cette instance. Maintenant, j'espère que vous me permettrez de poursuivre mes propos en anglais. Nous sommes dans le pays de la Teranga, donc bien sûr, nous devons faire aussi honneur à nos représentants, à nous exprimant aussi aux besoins sur la langue dans laquelle ils sont plus à l'aise. So I wanted to very much welcome you all for making this long trip. Some of you have been coming from South Africa, others have been coming from other countries in the continent and beyond the continent to attend this important regional conference on how we can empower Africa's voice and make sure that actually it is adequately conveyed at the G20. I think this meeting is extremely important, and definitely before even talking about it, I would like to thank our co-organizers, starting with the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIA, the United Nations Development Programme, and of course the AUDA NEPAD, for agreeing to host this important meeting here. Why is it important? I, of course, indicated earlier that South Africa is currently assuming the presidency of the G20 at a critical juncture. It follows the presidency of 2 other members of the Global South, namely Brazil and India, who very much did their best to make sure that the priorities of our countries across the Global South, but also in continents like Africa, are very much reflected in the agenda of the G20. And I can tell you that South Africa has been doing the same, even in a better way, because I have to say that I have been honored by South Africa to be appointed in the panel, the G20 expert panel that is currently working in support of the G20 presidency of South Africa. So of course, I can tell you that what South Africa has been doing is very much unprecedented. First of all, in making sure that the voice of developing countries, but most importantly, the voice of Africa is very much heard at the G20. The priorities of African countries are reflected in the G20 agenda, and making sure that beyond that, that the global discussions are very much focused on issues and priorities that matters for Africa and the Global South. And I think that this opportunity to very much have and host this conference is very much unprecedented in West Africa. I understand, of course, this has been done also in other part of the continent in Addis for East and Southern Africa. And this is the opportunity now for West Africa to also very much have this opportunity to do a lot of things that this conference is aiming to achieve. First of all, the most important part is for this conference to be an opportunity to convey and to explain and to enhance the understanding of G20 processes and working groups and task force and others. This is critical. The G20 is extremely complex. It has many working groups, it has many engagement groups, and we are very much delighted that actually our co-host Saya is actually heading what is called the T20. The T20 is the group within the G20 that sort of include and comprise all of the think tanks that are from members of the G20, and this is critical. So having, of course, Elizabeth here with us is a very good opportunity to hear more from her about that. Second, around this room, and of course online, we do have various type of stakeholders. We do have, of course, policymakers, and thanks again to the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Cooperation to have to be represented here and to pronounce their opening remarks. We are very honored by your participation. So beyond the policymakers, we do also have, of course, think tanks who are represented. We do have multilateral organizations, including, of course, our co-host, UNDP, but also I see in the room some representatives from the African Development Bank, some other also who are from the media. So the reality, the objective of this conference is to make sure that we take this opportunity to share with all of those shareholders about what are the priorities of South Africa as it actually takes on the presidency of the G20. So we hope that by very much fostering the understanding of the G20, that would very much help actually very much stakeholders to also contribute, because that's the second part of this gathering, which is to hear from you and also to get the voices and the insights from stakeholders so that people like Catherine, Saya, and others can go back to the South African authorities and share with them what is the perspective of stakeholders that are represented here. And this is critical because I think one thing that we know from South Africa is as it assumes its presidency of the G20, it has really very much adopted an inclusive approach, which is to very much go and try to meet with all stakeholders, whether they're state representative or non-state actors, to get their perspective so that they can, on their part, go and convey perspective from African stakeholders to the G20. And I think this is critical. So this is also the other objective of this gathering, and we are very much hoping that you will take advantage of it as much as we can. But I do know that you're not here to listen to us. You're more here to listen actually to our distinguished participants. So I'll stop here, and I would very much again thank you for coming and being with us today. And of course, those who are also online. And we promise that we're going to have a very productive discussion today and tomorrow. And without any further ado, I'm going to, of course, give back the mic to Maggie to introduce the next speakers. Thanks again, and welcome to Dakar. Bienvenue au pays de la Teranga. Merci.
Merci, Dauda, and thank you so much for giving us much more context on South Africa's G20 and reiterating why we're here today and tomorrow. I'd like to invite Ms. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, the CEO of SIA, which is the South African International Institute for International Relations. Thank you.
Bonjour, merci Dauda, and thank you also for your contribution to the G20, South African G20 presidency. I'm going to stand on the protocol that has gone before and also just specifically mention Mr. Jibril. Thank you very much for being here and for your opening remarks. I wasn't going to not listen to the translation just in case I misunderstood you, but if I stay here a little longer, I'm going to improve my French. So I wanted to start by saying I'm going to put into a bit of practice some of my language skills and to say that c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici à Dakar. C'est ma première fois pour une conférence sur la G20 en cette année de présidence de l'Afrique du Sud qui place la préoccupation et les priorités africaines au premier plan. This is very, very important, and I think it's also something that Daouda has emphasized. Mais cela fait longtemps que je n'ai pas pratiqué mon français et je passe maintenant à l'anglais pour vous épargner mon accent et mes fautes de grammaire. We began discussing the possibility of bringing a discussion on the G20 during South Africa's presidency to Senegal, to West Africa, sort of nearly a year ago, I think, Daouda. We were together at the UN General Assembly last year, and we had already begun discussions on what South Africa was putting on the agenda for the G20. And we thought this is the first African presidency of the G20. This is also now the second year that the African Union is sitting as a proper full member in the G20. And it is a unique opportunity to really build up the engagement, the awareness of G20 issues in the broader African policy community, the think tank community, the knowledge community, and take it to where possible to every part of the continent. Because at the end of the day, we have a seat as the African Union in the G20, and the African Union represents the entire continent. And so conversations and engagements on the G20 should be happening across the continent, even if individual members are not sitting in those seats around the table. And that is something that actually will have to continue beyond South Africa's G20 presidency this year. Because the G20 is important because it is a platform that brings together systemically important countries and regions to discuss issues that are also being discussed and articulated and pushed in other more formal multilateral processes. The UN, the discussions around the financing for development and the Compromiso de Sevilla that took place in June, July. The WTO, on the IMF and the World Bank, and the reforms that need to take place there. On climate change, COP30 is starting in a few weeks. These are all very important issues, concerns for Africans, and they're also being discussed at the G20. And while I sadly have to recognize that we are entering a period when the age of consensus, which I think characterized a large part of probably the last 30 years, is unfortunately being frayed, and some would even say is coming to an end. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be raising our voices even more in global fora about the issues that we know are affecting us very, very seriously. It is about how we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. It is about how we deal with the terrible effects of natural disasters as a result of climate change. It is how we're able to secure the future of our children by not becoming indebted as a result of what has happened with climate. That we have to be both resilient in the way in which we can respond to disasters linked to climate in terms of infrastructure, but also resilient in terms of our finances. All of these are going to be with us even in this age where divisions are much greater, unfortunately, and the consensus over things like the Sustainable Development Goals or the climate agenda are being contested. And so this is really a call to action for all of us across the continent to redouble our efforts to really not only make sure the issues that are important for us are on the agenda of the G20 and other important fora, but that we're actually shaping the outcomes of these. And in order to do that, not only do we have to make sure we continue these conversations across the continent, we have to make sure that we are promoting them and advancing them through the media. We need to make sure that we're building up coordination and cooperation among the knowledge community, and that we are, the knowledge community and the policymakers are actually working together and in sync. And this conference here today and tomorrow, Dauda, is really, so I see this as the first of conferences that we should be working on in the future, both in Senegal and in South Africa. Senegal is a really important international player. I just think most recently in the last couple of years, the role that it has played in driving some of the issues around food security on the global agenda in the Ukraine-Russia war. I think there are great synergies among key actors across the continent who can be champions and drive some of these agendas forward. And then how we as a think tank, as a knowledge community can support that. So before I carry on anymore, I, in the first instance, really want to thank you, Dauda, and your amazing team at AfriCatalyst for really a wonderful partnership, which we hope we, as I said, will continue. I want to thank our partners, the UNDP and AUDA and NEPAD as well, for being engaged with all of our outreach efforts to the continent over the last year. We've been to East Africa. We've obviously done quite a bit in Southern Africa, and we are now in the next 2 weeks convening the Think 20 summit in Johannesburg, which will bring together not just G20 but African. The African Union is a member, so a lot of African think tanks also into those discussions. So really big thank you to those partners, and then also to my team that has really driven this, Goodwill and Kesa and Rafilwe, who are here with us today. So let me stop there and say I really look forward to the conversations here in Senegal, in West Africa, and let this be the first of many more. I think I need to come back to Senegal fairly soon.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your remarks. And I'm sure this is the first of many events and conferences. At this particular moment, I would like to invite Ms. Catherine Fong, the Deputy Resident Representative of UNDP Senegal.
Monsieur le représentant du ministère de l'économie, de la planification et de la coopération, Madame la présidente de l'Institut sud-africain des affaires internationales, Monsieur le président d'AfriCatalyst, chers membres de la communauté diplomatique, Mesdames et Messieurs, bienvenue à Dakar pour cette conférence très importante. Alors, je vais continuer en anglais, parce que ça fait 2 ans que je n'ai pas donné de discours en anglais, donc je vais en profiter. Je vais en profiter quand on a des interprètes. I was just saying, I haven't given any speech in English for 2 years, so this is my little treat to myself. But on behalf of UNDP, I really want to welcome you all to Dakar, to this very important conference. And really starting by thanking our partners, AfriCatalyst, South African Institute of International Affairs, the African Union Development Agency, for this for co-organizing with us this very important conference on empowering Africa's voice within the G20. For us, the major objective of this gathering is to try to identify implementable financing solutions for our countries, our cities, our communities. And here, for UNDP, we're taking a very practical approach. We try to knit together policy, evidence, and execution so that political commitments translate into pipelines, transactions, and measurable outcomes. And really, you will see from the program that this conference was designed with that spirit in mind, bringing policy shapers, market actors, and knowledge partners into one room to align incentives and identify instruments that would lower Africa's cost of capital and expand fiscal space. You will hear from my UNDP colleagues that will present new evidence on debt sustainability in Africa, with a focus on West Africa. Because we want proposals that are grounded in the region's realities and not generic prescriptions. And hopefully, during these 2 days, we will work towards setting a clear framework for rethinking Africa's debt, evaluating proposals across global forums, and converging on what is feasible now, what needs coalition building, and what demands systemic reform. We will ensure coherence across tracks through connecting G20 priorities to financing for development, follow through, and the road to COP30, which is about to start very soon in Belém. So our task is to map the right reform levers to the right venue and to assign owners for delivery. So we will focus, hopefully, on reforms that lower the cost of capital, with an explicit elaboration of short, medium, and long-term policy and market actions to reduce risks premia and expand affordable finance, which our countries so much need. UNDP's offer is to help countries and regional bodies take those actions to market. And our aim is to support governments across the continent to operationalize country financing platforms that link fiscal frameworks with investable pipelines. And so we will continue to work with finance ministries, central banks, and regulators for market development. And this complements the program's emphasis on aligning global commitments with country execution. But what I want to also say at the end of my speech is really stating we like conferences, but we also like outcomes. And by the close of these 2 days, we should be able to leave this room with hopefully 3 tangible outputs. Number 1, a concise menu of actions, immediate, near-term, and systemic, that countries and partners can feed into budgets, policy calendars, and transaction roadmaps, again, to reducing financing costs. Second, we would also like to see a short Dakar document or note, no pressure, linking non-state actor recommendations to government's asks and G20 financing for development COP venues, with maybe a light governance setup for tracking who's doing what and by when. And finally, we would also like to see a clear work plan for the Borrowers Forum set to take place in Zambia, as you know. And everything we propose must pass 3 tests: affordability, additionality, and accountability. the 3 A's. Affordability, because of course, development that is too expensive is not development at all. Additionality, because scarce public resources must crowd in, not crowd out private finance and citizen initiative. And thirdly, accountability, because our citizens deserve to see that each reform and each instrument translate into job resilience and services, especially for women and the many young people who carry a disproportionate share of today's shocks. So once again, let me thank our co-hosts and the many contributors on today's program, including our AU colleagues, South African G20 team. And let me acknowledge the program directors and all the moderators for the coming 2 days. And to finish again, let me reiterate UNDP's commitment to the agenda that you will discuss over the next 2 days. And we stand ready to continue working with you in the coming weeks and months. Thanks a lot. Jerry.
Thank you very much. Technical, could we have the Zoom up, please? So online, we have Dr. Bartholomew Kingsley Amar, Senior Economist at AUDA NEPAD, joining us virtually to give us some remarks. I just want to call the technical team to bring him up for his remarks. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maggie. Let me start by acknowledging our partners from SAIA, Elizabeth.
We can't hear you, I think.
Ooh, really?
You might want to unmute.
I have unmuted. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I'm sure there is a problem with the room.
Okay, can anybody hear Patrick?
No.
Can you hear us?
I think all the online people can hear each other, but not the room.
Please nod your head if you can hear me. Okay. Could we get his sound, please? Okay. Okay, I think we lost him for a second. And with that, I would like to thank you very much to our panelists for the opening and welcome remarks, Dauda, and a big round of applause.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay, we can hear you. There you are.
Can you
Sorry.
hear us? Okay.
I think we can bring his picture back and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Okay. So I'll get right to it. Good morning, distinguished guests. On behalf of, my name is Bartholomew Amar, Senior Economist with in the Office of the Chief Executive Officer of AUDA NEPAD. On behalf of our CEO, Nados Bekele Thomas, it's our profound honor to welcome you to this gathering. Obviously, we're here not just to talk, but to transform or facilitate the transformation process in the continent. The theme, empowering Africa's voice within the G20, is no longer an aspiration, but it's our new reality. With the AU now a permanent member of the G20, Africa no longer speaks from the margins, we speak from the table. We have moved from waiting in the hallway to shaping the agenda inside the room. But this hard-won seat comes with profound responsibility. The responsibility to ensure that our demographic weight, our economic dynamism, and our unique development priorities are no longer footnotes, but central chapters in the story of our global future. So we meet at a crossroads in history, but we have crossed this road before. The fundamental development issues of poverty, debt, inequality, and conflict persist despite some progress. But what is different are the emerging tools, mechanisms, and opportunities that can help us navigate the crossroads. These include technical innovations such as AI, the rising demand for critical minerals, the creation of the AFCFTA, our demographic dividend, and Africa's permanent seat at the G20. But having access to these tools is one thing. Our ability to strategically and effectively use them is another. Under South Africa's G20 presidency, we have seen what is possible. We have demonstrated a growing ability to coordinate, to articulate, and to influence global policy on the issues that matter most to our people: debt sustainability, climate finance, and the reform of an international financial architecture that does not effectively mirror our strategic interests. But let's be clear. Engagement is not enough. Presence is not power. What we require is strategic coherence and leverage underpinned by a sustained continent-wide effort to move from participation to influence and from influence to tangible outcomes. So what are the pathways to these tangible outcomes? First and foremost, we need to confront our financial realities with a sense of urgency and purpose. In 2023 alone, Sub-Saharan Africa's external debt stock reached 863 billion, up from 841 billion in 2022. This figure represents 169% of total exports. Meanwhile, Africa's high bond yields, averaging 9.8%, have elevated our debt service costs to about 16% of export revenue in 2023. This is a massive drain on our future. Furthermore, the continent is estimated to lose 88 billion annually in illicit financial flows. This represents approximately 20% of the continent's total tax revenue of 448 billion in 2022, based on a tax to GDP ratio of 16%. Stopping IFFs could increase the tax to the GDP ratio by 3 percentage points, thereby expanding the fiscal space of governments and increasing financing of social services. At the same time, Africa remains the only region in the world without a regional financing arrangement. This is why the creation of the African Monetary Fund and the African Stability Mechanism is so critical. The AFSM alone is projected to save African countries an estimated $20 billion in debt servicing costs over the next decade. This isn't just policy, it's practical liberation. Second, we need to harness our greatest asset, our people. Africa's demographic vitality is our potential superpower. But I must sound a note of urgency. This window of opportunity is narrowing. High informality and insufficient job creation threaten to turn this immense advantage into a risk of social instability. We must empower this generation. Mobile money has been a powerful tool for inclusion, but access is not enough, as was emphasized in the G20 Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion Working Group. We must broaden the quality of usage, which depends on robust digital infrastructure and elevated financial literacy. And we cannot ignore the tectonic shift of AI. There is an asymmetry of AI power, and we must address it head on. By embracing the African Union's continental AI strategy and by adopting a regional approach to financing digital infrastructure, we can ensure AI becomes a tool for African development, not just a new form of dependency. Africa has more than 2,400 organizations working on AI innovation in various industries, including health, agriculture, education, law, and insurance. They include entities like Ujuzi Kilimo in Kenya that uses sensors and machine learning to analyze soil data, SUA Code in Ghana that teaches coding on smartphones, and the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences that runs a renowned Masters in Machine Intelligence program, training the next generation of AI leaders. Third, we must lead the charge on climate justice, turning the climate crisis into a developmental opportunity. This requires beneficiation of our critical minerals and harnessing our natural capital for renewable energy. But we must tackle the headwinds and insist on a just transition. And what do I mean? For instance, carbon taxes like the EU's border adjustment mechanism threatens to negatively impact our fiscal positions and accelerate the stranding of our assets. Meanwhile, carbon offset projects in Africa face lower carbon prices, limiting their developmental financing potential, the development financing potential. The solution? Invest in strengthening our own carbon registries and verification systems to boost the value of our natural capital. And we must advocate for the scaling up of multilateral development bank lending, optimal use of the balance sheets of multilateral development banks, and the rechanneling of special drawing rights to ensure financing is both adequate and equitable. We must also leverage our remittances for development. In 2023 alone, Africa received approximately 90 billion in remittances, equivalent to FDI and ODA combined. These flows are critical for household survival, but with appropriate policies and instruments. Finally, we must be forward-looking. The financial landscape is evolving, and Bitcoin and stablecoins are likely to become a permanent part of it. We must understand these innovations, engage with them, and ensure that they serve our development goals, not undermine them. So over these 2 days, our deliberations must be more than academic. We are here to connect think tanks, policymakers, the private sector, and development partners to build a unified African agenda. We must answer the pivotal question: how can Africa strategically shape the global financial and climate architecture to align with the visionary aspirations of Agenda 2063? Let us approach these discussions with intellectual rigor, collective purpose, and unwavering passion. Let us transform this forum from a place of reflection into a platform for coherence, foresight, and actionable African leadership. We have the table. Now let's set the agenda. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bat, for your opening remarks and for joining us online. I know it can be a little bit tricky with the connections, so we appreciate your time. And with those remarks, I would like to say thank you to Dauda, Miss Elizabeth, Miss Catherine, and Bart, and to the Director General. Thank you so much for making it, and I would let you go back to the audience. Welcome once again for those joining us online and those in the room already. Thank you so much for keeping with us. We will now move into our next session, which is focused on strategic coordination and influence, African engagement in global policy forums. This session will focus on how countries and institutions in Africa can work together more effectively to influence major global decision-making spaces, including the G20, FFD4, and other key forums. And join me in welcoming our panelists. I think I saw one of them here. He might have stepped out. Shedian, could you kindly help me get back him in? Miss Liana, I think, please to the stage. His Excellency Jean Kontanga. I think we haven't located him yet. So we will proceed with 2 panelists. That also means that we'll have as much time to engage and we'll have as much time for Q&As, if any. Thank you so much. Thanks again for joining us. We have one panelist who might join us along the way, but in any case, we have as much time, so it's good we can talk and we can engage. I will also be coming to get any questions in French as well. Feel free to let me know and I'll give you the microphone. Sheikh, thanks for joining us and thank you for having time this morning. As we've heard from all the panelists today, opening the floor, I think what's very critical is South Africa's G20 has come at a very critical time. And it's very evident as well as, we move along that Africa's priorities are set forth, but also are set into tangible results. I had a discussion with you, Liana, in the morning where we discussed that, beyond just having these priorities, people want to see their lives changed, which brings me to the question that we are now on the table. We have the AU, we have South Africa leading with the G20. What would you like to see come out of these conversations that would really make a real difference for the ordinary persons, but also for countries across the continent?
Thank you. Yes, I'm audible. Thank you very much, moderator. I just want to start actually with a vision that South Africa has set as the nexus between the global South and the developed North. South Africa is going to chair with a vision under the motto solidarity, equality, and sustainable development. And that is the energy that we would want to see in the long term, that we maintain the momentum of whatever is discussed. I was fortunate to be on the BRICS team as we worked there at the DIRCO headquarters. There were also a number of preparatory meetings, just like with the G20 now. I believe there are 132 meetings before actually the leaders will meet within a month in Sandton and Johannesburg and conclude the declaration on the presidential level. What is very important in the end is that South Africans will ask us what benefits did the G20 and our chairpersonship of the G20 bring for South Africa and the benefits that it brought for the continent. So it is really a moment in time for us to bring this leadership to the table. From my experience on the BRICS team, there are extremely long negotiations. There are many meetings. In BRICS, we had, for example, MENA meeting, Middle East and North Africa. We also had the foreign ministry meeting. So we have the officials that are negotiating, that are bringing the text. But at the end of the day, it is the leaders that will sign the presidential declaration. So they can still change some of the wording in the end because they have to actually execute it. So it is extremely important because it is a complex forum if you look at the interests that are represented there, the developed North, that are also tired of the talk about debt and development aid. They want to see more trade. There's the Global South that has got their own specific agenda. And I'm going to go through it because what the agenda that President Ramaphosa has said, because I think it's important, it sets the context, and we cannot continue without actually going quickly through all the priorities that President Ramaphosa has articulated when he engaged with the foreign ministers meeting for the G20 earlier on the year. And these priorities are now also being negotiated through our Sous Sherpa from Durko, Sous Sherpa, Ambassador Mabongo, as they are preparing for the last 30 days. So I'm starting with the priorities because I think we cannot really engage in any question or have any reflection if we don't have the context so that we have a vision. And then after the G20, what is important is that we attain the momentum of this vision and have some tangible result, as was said by one of the other speakers here, the UNDP, that we actually see the pipeline of the projects, what is going to materialize. So firstly, South Africa has put on the agenda disaster, risk, resilience, and what is flowing from climate change. So we want to see an outcome there in the presidential declaration. Secondly, South Africa has put on the agenda on behalf of Africa and also the developing world, debt sustainability, because the issue with lower income countries is that they simply don't have enough funds to put into the budget for social issues and health education because they're paying their budget back to debt at a high interest rate. Priority 3, financing the just energy transition. You will know when you listen to the South African president, that is a term that South Africa has actually not only brought to the table, but has also popularized as a just energy transition as we moved from fossil fuel. And that is very important for the developing South. Also that we are not are necessarily paying the debt of the climate change and financing the negative impacting of climate change whilst we didn't do anything to contribute to all these factors. And then the fourth one to me is very exciting, critical minerals, the critical minerals that are abundant in Africa, and that Africans be the beneficiaries of what these critical minerals can bring in terms of finance to transition also to new technologies. So these are the 4 issues that we want to see in the presidential declaration. And then the additional priorities, they are more cross-cutting. They are also for food security. We saw with COVID and also the war in Ukraine that Africa is very much negatively impacted due to the supply chain. So we'll put that on the agenda. And another very exciting item, artificial intelligence, because Africa has fallen behind. Whilst other countries, you know, more developed countries like the United Arab Emirates and others, they even have ministers for artificial intelligence. So we want to bring this to the table. Gender equality, women's empowerment, and again, climate change. Climate change remains very important on the agenda that South Africa has put forward on behalf of Africa and the developing world. Now, I think we can then proceed to discuss the main issue about the lessons that we've learned from our other participation is really in the end of the day, and that people will ask, ordinary people, did this create jobs? What is it that it brings? And for us then, the vision that we have now discussed and the priorities that we've discussed, we need to maintain the energy to execute this. Practically, you know, it is a matter of staffing. Myself, I was just seconded to the BRICS team. Then afterwards, I did another assignment. Now I'm in Dakar. So we don't have sufficient staffing to maintain the priorities. I think it's a issue all over government at the moment. So we'll need a lot of support from the non-government organizations and institutions that we must maintain the momentum, we must staff, we must coordinate. But most importantly, I think at the end, once they sign on the 23rd, 24th of November, the presidential declaration, is that the leaders there must actually execute and keep to what has been promised and what has been agreed on. I can tell you that from the BRICS, you know, the leaders can go through the night. They're not always happy with what their delegations has brought them. They can feel that it's not something that they can actually deliver. You know, if you think about BRICS, you hear in the media there's going to be a BRICS currency. So that means that during the negotiations, one of the countries put that on the agenda, but in the end, it didn't go through. And there is no BRICS currency. But I'm just giving that as an example to say that what is really happening in the negotiations, and those are close negotiations, the leaders, all of them, and there will be a number, the G20, they must be very comfortable when they sign the final outcome. And then they will need to make good on what it is that has been agreed upon. That will be very important. So we will definitely support as much as possible in the aftermath of the G20 to see that we don't lose the momentum. That will be our greatest challenge, that we don't have sufficient energy to continue with this vision that we've just discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lee. And I think key thing here is we don't lose the momentum as we hand over to the next G20 presidency. Of course, priorities differ, but South Africa has been very clear with these priorities that are very critical for Africa's development. But also, like you've mentioned, things like capacity are needed, especially for some of these forums. And that's why I want to bring you in, Ashay. In terms of coordination, obviously, climate, debt, these are global complex issues where you need much more support, especially for countries. Talk to us about how regional bodies and development institutions, multilateral institutions like FDB come in to support, and what kind of support do you actually provide?
Hi. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Africatalis for the invitation, to Order NEPA, to UNDP for the collaboration, and SIIA for making the trip all the way from South Africa to Dakar. And I hope you have a very fruitful stay in our native city. It's an honor for me to be here. My name is Sheikh Jain. I'm an advisor to the Vice President Finance and Chief Financial Officer of the African Development Bank. And in my current role, I represent the African Development Bank at the G20 International Financial Architecture Working Group, which is one of the main working groups that discusses some of the topics that you mentioned, what it is debt sustainability, what it's about mobilizing concessional financing, MDB roadmap for better, bigger, and more effective MDBs, the cost of capital. All those are the big topics that are discussed in that particular working group. In a previous role, when I was in the Senegalese government, I was fortunate to be the deputy representing the African Union. And we played a big role in making sure that the African Union, under the Senegalese African Union presidency, became a permanent member. Mr. Dauda Semben used to be advisor to the president, and he played a role in that. And just want to mention the leadership, as you mentioned, that Senegal has been playing in the international forums, and that's the leadership we will continue to sustain. So to answer your question about coordination and the role of the African Development Bank, coordination is key. the African Development Bank, when the South African G20 presidency started, said, we want to have an African G20 presidency. And as your bank, we want you to play a lead role in that. And we took that on hand. We got approval from our board to have some money in order to set up an a G20 coordination unit at the African Union with a team of technical experts, as well as a person who's just dedicated to maintaining the relationships between the African Development Bank and the African Union, who sits in Addis. So from an institutional perspective, we put that. We had deployed some financial resources just to make sure that it is operational. As the speakers mentioned, there are over 130 meetings. Myself, I hadn't been to South Africa in 10 years, but this year I've already went 4 times. So every 2 months, I'm in South Africa for a G20 meeting. So these are very heavy in terms of cost, transportation, logistics. But more fundamentally, if you want to sustain it, is to have a pool of experts, the institutional memory, because currently the way in which the G20 is set up by a troika system. So the past presidency, the current presidency, and the future presidency, those are the troika. There's no permanent secretariat. So sometimes you can be in the negotiating room, you're negotiating in language, and then somebody says, well, it was agreed in Rome. You don't know what that means. What the person is saying that as part of the Rome Declaration under the Italian G20 presidency in 2021, this was language in that declaration. And so if you're not in the room, if you haven't been following this, you can miss the context, you can miss the implications, you can miss the nuances. And those things are important because in other parts of the world, if you look at the European Union Commission, or France or other countries, they have dedicated teams that just do G20, G7 year round. So all of the information that are connecting from past years, they have it. So there's always continuity. And that is something that is important for us to establish that continuity, withstanding the different G20 presidencies. As Dauda mentioned in his opening remarks, we had a succession of sort of G20 presidencies from the Global South. 2022 Indonesia, 2023 India, 2024 Brazil, 2025 South Africa. So moving to the United States and then the UK. It's going to be a very different presidency in the United States. What's important is to make sure that our priorities are going to be on top and center of the presidency. What has the South African G20 presidency done? In the last finance minister and central bank governor meeting, they've established and endorsed what's called the Africa Engagement Framework. What we've realized in these past few years, there's a lot of different Africa topics that are sort of spread across the different working groups. What it is about infrastructure, what it's about debt sustainability, what it's about financing, spread across International Financial Working Group, Framework Working Group, Infrastructure Working Group. So we've regrouped these pillars across 5 pillars. There's a fiscal and debt management. There's one on debt sustainability. There's a pillar on MDB revolution. There's a pillar on the reducing of the cost of capital. And then finally is about cross-border infrastructure. These are the 5 pillars in which we're going to be engaging from 2026 to 2030 across the different G20 presidencies to make sure that Africa's priorities are going to be front and center. And in order for you to execute on that, you need to have good coordination. This is where the African Development Bank is going to come in. For the South African G20 presidency, not only did we provide the financial support, but we actually organized as part of their priorities some high-level events. For example, in March in Pretoria, we organized a debt roundtable at the International Financial Architecture Working Group. We had 14 different countries, including Zambia, including Ethiopia, including Ivory Coast, Senegal, etc., to talk to us about debt management. It was the first time that they can actually hear from, for example, Zambia, which was the first country that entered the common framework for debt restructuring, which was an initiative started under the Saudi Arabian G20 presidencies, to tell them this process is slow. We needed more transparent. We needed more time bound. We need to have comparability of treatment. These are the lessons learned. This enabled the G20 members to then produce 2 reports that were then published. Lessons learned on the common framework, and then the steps towards debt for debt restructuring. Having the African Development Bank with our convening power have in front of them debtors was eye-opening for them. The second thing we did is also in June, we had another high-level roundtable on the cost of capital. So we had ODI, we had Lion's Head, we had the representative from our regional member countries to really think about what are the impediments to growth. We had identified 4, and one of them being the cost of capital, where we're paying over 300 to 400 basis points more than our comparative peers. So we were able to convene that high-level working group and have some actions come out of that. And all of those documents have been rolled over to the ministerial meetings, which just happened last October in Washington, DC. These are some of the things that the African Development Bank can do, not only from a policy dialogue perspective, from a convening perspective, but also from a technical body. We were able to produce briefs for the G20 presidency. We produce reports, we produce papers. With the African Union Commission, we install what's called Fridays at the Commission. We talk about on specific topics. I think we have some representatives of the African Union here. I think Dr. Patrick, who can speak very elaborately, and he's been doing a fantastic job at the African Union on that. These are ways in which we want to institutionalize our presence. We're going to be the knowledge body for for Africa, and we need to work together in partnership. There's a role to play for the think tanks. There's a role to play for Order NEPAD. There's a role to play for UNECA, and we need to do it in partnership to speak with one voice under one Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. The discussion is still ongoing, but if you have any questions, let me know. Leon, I saw you nod your head when you talked about strategy, and I was really bringing that to both of you, saying, you know, what could really be a true effective African strategy when it comes to coordination? Because that's something you kept on mentioning and you kept on nodding your head.
Oh, yes. It's probably because when I arrived in West Africa, I realized we had such a lot of work to do because we are on one continent and we are divided by languages, so the French and the English. Of course, we all have our indigenous languages. But, you know, we have to really introduce these regions to each other, because officially in terms of policy, we work in terms of building blocks. So the SADC must work with the ECOWAS, and ECOWAS needs to be introduced much more to SADC. And overarching, there is the Agenda 2063, that Africa is prosperous and peaceful, and that we have achieved all these goals, the development goals. And that is what informs our coordination. But in practice, these links are very weak. I think I communicated with Saya that the mission here, well, I met with, for example, with the West African Research Institute, and they said they had also worked with our research bodies, and they were so keen. I forwarded a long report to Durko head office because I said, well, we have not seen researchers and policy makers from South Africa and Southern Africa in some time. So really, we need to strengthen the collaboration and the building blocks. It is a vast continent, and we are informed by the Agenda 2063, but the linkages and the understanding of the regions in Africa, we need to be very practical to strengthen those linkages. Of course, we as a mission has a role. Recently, the ambassador hosted a television crew, and we introduced the South African cuisine. And there are so many opportunities, you know, through culture, also soft diplomacy, and introducing our various cultures. And people say that is not important, but if the peoples don't have an understanding and appreciation, it makes it very difficult to build the bridges to trade. And that is where we need to be going with all of. After everything has been said, that is very much important, the Africa free trade, inter-Africa trade, how we trade with the blocks. But I can sadly tell you, I've been here since February, and we have just so much work to do to strengthen all of the linkages, the cultural linkages, the sports linkages. You know, for example, Senegal is going to be hosting the the Youth Olympics. So at home we are also informing the departments, and we are at just a pivotal time that we must show our solidarity for what is taking place in Africa. So South Africa is going to be having the chairship of the G20, and South Africa is providing leadership. Next year, Senegal is providing leadership in Youth Olympics and so forth. There are many countries providing leadership and how we support each other. But we do have a lot of work to do to strengthen our linkages and to, our understanding. And we need to work through the formal building blocks, which is the SADC and the African Union, but we need to establish a very much a stronger bond between ECOWAS and SADC.
Yeah, and maybe ESC. But again, I just want your thoughts on that. So we are on the table. We are in these forums, of course, and we have our priorities set, but the coordination, the regional coordination still seems to be a little bit slower. Are there any immediate strategies you could share with us? Or is this something you actually deal with as well in your institution?
Yeah, I think, you know, coordination in general is always a challenge, I think, because it's such a big effort, 54 countries, so many different priorities, different visions. And so finding what are the key sets of priorities that could be cutting across the continent, that can be actionable, that can be sustainable, that can be consistently delivered across the international forums is number one, I think, the main thing we need to do, to be consistently delivering the message across the international forums in terms of what are our priorities and our goals and objectives. That's the what. The how, I think you need to be clear in terms of who plays a lead role, who plays a technical role, a supporting role, a financial role, and everybody has a role to play and they stay in that lane. The African Union is the body that has the seat at the table. So they're the ones representing the African voices there. They should be playing the lead role. The African Development Bank, for example, the Knowledge Bank, the bank for the regional member countries, has a role to play on a technical side, on the financial side, in terms of providing the technical expertise for some of these topics such as domestic resource mobilization, fiscal management, debt sustainability. These are very specific technical topics that a bank such as the African Development Bank in our economic knowledge complex deals with on a daily basis and can provide that support. I think we just need to make sure that we also have a mechanism to dialogue between countries, between different institutions. I think some ideas, I think having quarterly retreats of African Union international organizations focused on African countries. There was something that was organized in the UK. I think W participated. I think initiatives such as, you know, working with the ambassadors who are the legal representatives in their countries, making sure that they get the message because they're the represent the authorities in that particular country so that they can also be a voice to deliver messages. It's going to be one big in the United States to do that as they're assuming the next G20. So all of the African ambassadors in DC need to be on board and you need to be, they could not be an afterthought. They need to be prioritized in part of delivering these messages because then they are going to be the vehicle to their countries who can then also have the working groups to deliver some of the technical knowledge. The STCs, I think the African Union will talk about that. Having pre-meetings before you go into these international forums. I think one time with this past few months, what I saw that there was an STC with the ministers in South Africa. And then right after that, they went to the G20 meetings. I think that's a very good idea. Coordinating in Africa, talk about African topics before going into the international forums is something we need to institutionalize. There are always going to be 2 G20 meetings in DC. That has been the case in the spring meetings and the annual meetings. And before that, you can work backwards to have some of these meetings. You need to have an update report from the African Union to the members on how our priorities being set, how are we tracking against you know, the the policies that we have set in place and the key actions that we want on a quarterly basis. There needs to be more dialogue between those. So retreats, quarterly updates, annual reports on progress, and then really strong engagements between South Africa, because they're a permanent member of the G20, the African Union, and the other regional bodies. You mentioned, Your Excellency, that SADC and ECOWAS maybe do not talk to each other as much. I think there's an opportunity for the regional bodies to really talk, learn from one another. And I think the African Development Bank can be one that can facilitate some of that, or the African Union. But we really need to have a political will, and that's really the message for the countries, the political will to make sure that the African Union seat at the G20 is a success. Nothing will be successful if there's no political will. The political will also mentions these are the representatives that you're going to be sending to these institutions. They are the crème de la crème. These are the technical teams that are going to be there, the crème de la crème. These are the financial means that you need to be deployed for it to be resourceful. These are all political wills because you're taking resources away from other priorities. So it needs to be a priority among priorities from the government level. And that, I think, is another message. And that's why the ambassadors are going to be the vehicles to be championing some of those. And it's not coincidence that we are having this discussion with the representative of South Africa. And so it's something to keep in mind as we really deploy a sustainable framework for engagement at the G20 for the years to come.
Absolutely, and I think this dialogue or this past event here in Senegal gives us a step forward. It shouldn't be the last. And again, we bring that to Dauda, Africa Lesai, and UNDP. That with dialogues is a start of the retreats and regional events where we can meet and discuss some of these critical issues. I want to bring in again, Liana, and given that South Africa is passing on to its presidency to the United States, of course, different country with different priorities. We have we've done so much. South Africa have done quite a lot in terms of setting the priorities, but the question on sustainability and continuity, how do we sustain this momentum, and what kind of mechanisms? And I would love to bring you in, Shay, maybe after she gives us her perspective.
Yes, that definitely will be the challenge. I was listening to what you said. I do agree with you, and the role of the ambassadors. Normally when South African delegations go to participate in the UN, there's a national preparatory phase there at Durko building in Pretoria. And we need that on a grand scale so that there's an Africa preparatory phase. We really do need the ambassadors on the continent to be informed so that we can have a cohesive strategy. They can also meet virtually so that we are prepared. Because if we do not put all these mechanisms and building blocks in place, we can just guess what is going to happen. South Africa's approach is a multilateral approach. We do this within BRICS. We are with the non-aligned movement as well, and we advocate for the reform of the UN system at large. But when the US will take over the G20, we're going to see much a different approach. And that approach, we can speculate that it will be based on trade, as we see now with the AGOA, where the US we're still busy renegotiating it. So, and we must be prepared for the events that will probably unfold. Of course, as you know, just within BRICS, it is a troika system. So the leaders will meet. It is disappointing if the US is not sending the president to the G20 in November, because we don't want the G20 to lose its importance in the world. It is the main policy discussion forum. And its goal mainly is to deliberate on economic issues. I'm sure that the US is going to put the emphasis right back to the original conceptualization of the G20, and that is the development that we will need to manage. The only way is for the whole continent and the African representative to be prepared and to have the same messages and to agree in the 2026 US presidency. But we can do it. Let us look what is going to happen in November and what the leaders of the developed world will also agree to, because that agenda, once they agree to the declaration, that will also then encompasses the aspiration of the global south. That will be a very strong declaration. And the US will not be able to completely ignore what is going to be agreed on in November. But if we do not keep the momentum and we don't have working groups in all the African missions, including here in Dakar, so that we prepare and that we input in terms of, in our case, just to make an example, what is the views of the government here. And we also report on that, and we are all on one page for the next summit, then we will not lose the momentum and the vision that South Africa has now laid the foundation for.
I want to bring you in, Shape. Are there any practical steps that we could draw from past experiences and maybe where you've heard these positions to sustain the momentum? It's very critical when we talk about climate as a priority or lowering the cost of capital. I mean, these are issues that are Africa, and it's very imperative that the conversation, the dialogue continues even beyond the United States. So you mentioned the United States, you would be a little bit skeptical, but again, we have to think to be forward thinking and think of what can we do, safeguard or steps forward to continue this.
Yeah, let me also just really congratulate the South African presidency for their outstanding leadership this past year. There have been many things that they have done that are really in the right direction. So within the G20, actually, they had a commission to look at how do you streamline the process, at least on the finance track. That hasn't been talked enough. And I think leveraging more of the deputies' work, streamlining these communiques you mentioned. I can tell you in 2022, I was in Bali for the Leaders' Declaration. I mean, the last thing you want to do when you're in Bali is just to be sitting in a room for like 72 hours just negotiating like 2 words on a language, which unfortunately happened. Until 1 a.m. the night before, there was no agreement on consensus. And that was a very painful lesson for some of us who were in that room to do it. And I think South Africa really took that on board and said, we need to find a better way to streamline this process. So they issued a communique in the July FMCBG in Durban. And that process was very smooth. These very short communiques, a couple of days of negotiations, and then you had a communique consensus. And I think there's going to be, the US will build on that process. And it's something I really want to commend the leadership on that. We also have an Africa engagement framework. I think it was adopted at the FMCBG meeting. It's a menu of options. There's many things that are in there. I outlined previously the 5 pillars. Obviously, the US has 3 key priorities, and they said it's sustainable economic growth and resilience, financial regulatory modernization, energy abundance, and transition affordability. So at least from a practical perspective, even if you have a framework until 4 years, it's good to align our priorities that really coincide with what the US priorities are so that you can achieve tangible results and you minimize friction. I think that's a practical way of looking at what are our priorities that align with the US priorities and how we can advance on these. I think then the other tactics that I would mention is just, like I said, preparing this ahead of time, determining which working groups we're really going to focus on, having a pool of experts that are going to be available to prepare the briefing notes, the research, the methodology, leveraging the institutions, UNECA, African Development Banks, who can have maybe secondees to really, bolster that pool and really institutionalize this AU coordination unit that's sitting at the African Union. Now the commissioner is in place. She's the Sherpa. She has a team. We need to have that team. We need to have the governance, and we need to have institutionalized the mechanism, the reporting mechanism between the Union Commission and the member countries, and have an engagement also with the institutional bodies, and then determine ahead of time which meetings are we going to, who's going, what are the discussions, who's the expert writing this, what are the key points that we need to have. All of these so that you can then have the institutional memory, and this is how we defend these things. I am calling on South Africa to continue to maintain that leadership, because I think you established a really great framework for all of us to work on, and a really good relationship also with the African Union and the African Development Bank. I think those intangibles need to continue. Calling on the leadership of Africatalyst, who's an expert in the domain, and other think tanks, SIAA, to really also step in and play that role. Africatalyst also has a presence in the United States, and I think that you can also play a role in facilitating some of these, at least at the political level. So that would be some tactical ways in which we can make this work.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if we have any comments. So yes, Elizabeth, I'll give you the microphone.
Thanks. Just a really great discussion, both of you, and I think flagging some really important issues. I wanted to touch on 2 points. I think the one that Liana Anshanya actually made about the US. I think it is very important to work out ways in which, with the priorities they've identified, we can develop a common position. You know, they will be the presidency. I think we have to make sure that we support the process, the G20 process, to make sure that it doesn't descend into some of the challenges that you mentioned at the Bali summit, which also related, of course, to the Ukraine war. And I mean, I think it was, you know, at the end of it, we were all very relieved there was a leaders' declaration. I mean, we've had some challenges this year. We've had some working groups that have only issued a chair's summary. It was really great to see the finance declaration, the finance communique in July that you referred to. But I mean, there've been obviously challenges, and it's important to just keep it going. I think the other thing to consider, though, in terms of an African strategy, is also how we engage with the incoming troikas. So I think we need to reach out to the United Kingdom, because they will be working, you know, they will be taking over in 2027. And certainly on some issues that we, you know, in South Africa and the continent have been championing, I think we will find ready partners and ready champions. We already see that in some of the negotiations that have happened in various working groups. Real support for a lot of the developmental issues from some of the G7 members. And I think we need to keep that engagement as well. And so I would argue next year, I mean, we're now at the end of the 2025. I mean, Canada was chairing the G7, but next year, G7 is being chaired by France. Let's also sort of look at how we work together in both of these informal groupings to keep some of these issues on the agenda, even if they are not the priority in 2026. You know, it's a process. We know the G20 is a process. Sometimes you pick up things, you drop, you know, they sort of recede to the background, and then they pick up again later on. I mean, in Bali, there was the decision around social protection and adaptive social protection. This was picked up by the South Africans this year in the development working group. And now we have a call to action on universal social protection clause and so on. So I think we need to see it as a conveyor belt. We need to just keep moving. The other interesting just observation to make is you referred to the finance track, the streamlining of the finance track. There's obviously also the G20 at 20 review that is a part of the South African priorities. And there we've been involved with the Sherpa track. And there again, of course, the priority is, there's a recognition, I think, among all members that we need to just look at the agenda again and make sure that while it's flexible in terms of what is covered and what isn't, that over the last 15 years, 16 years, the agenda has really expanded, and that has affected actually the way in the efficiency, the accountability that you were also talking about, the action, the outcomes. And so it'll be interesting to see what the report says that will be tabled, will be discussed at the Sherpas meeting now, at the last Sherpa meeting, and what some of the recommendations for making sure that there is a much more streamlined G20, which I must add includes, and for a finance person, I'm not quite sure how you're going to take this, but it does include more coordination between the Sherpa and the finance tracks. I think that's critical because everything has a finance angle. And the last point is we did a similar event, a briefer event in Pretoria a couple of weeks ago, and we had a number of African institutions there. One of the points that they raised was that coordination is important, but sometimes we don't, the AFDB doesn't necessarily coordinate with, say, ARDA NEPAD or with UNECA or with APRM. They're all playing a role in one way or another, but it is so important to just be doing that. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. So just some reflections from our discussions over the last year. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to add in anything?
No, I mean,
no. Okay.
She said it's spot on. Spot on. We need to do better ourselves. Absolutely.
It would be nice to see how an African strategy really looks like beyond this presidency. I don't know if there's any other comments in the audience. Yes.
Thank you very much for an excellent session and for sharing your ideas. When you mentioned the second strategy for the US in terms of finance, and we see what has happened in terms of withdrawal of funds. I read about 2 days ago that Germany, as well as EU, are considering reducing financing in the health sector. So with US now heading the G20, how do you think African countries can position themselves, especially in that collaboration and discussions with the G20? Thank you.
No, you are, I think you are correct. We need to position ourselves within the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement. That is going to make our hands very strong. The US at the moment, they are investing in Africa, in a host country, Senegal. The President Faye also recently was part of the US-Africa summit there and discussions. The US actually invested quite in a number of projects to further mutual interest, because the country here has discovered oil and they're mining for gas, so they're a strong emerging economy. And that, I think, will be the approach that they take. They will be looking at their interest and where they can have make profitable investments. And of course, trade is another story with the tariffs. But as was said here, we need to find common positions, because if we don't do that, we are going to see a dilution of the trade policies that will support sustainable development objectives, particularly for our industrialization and our transition to value-added production, like we discussed at the beginning, the critical minerals. But we must urgently have this working group to look at the further implementation of the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement, because that will make our proposals are very, very strong. The US wants to make profitable investments and they want to trade. And we should find the common ground with them. And as a continent, we will be strong if we implement that agreement. Thank you.
Okay, we have a comment.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous, Baba Karniaï de Think Tank Wati. J'ai une question rapide. C'est sur la perspective de la présidence sud-africaine comparée à celle du Brésil lorsqu'on parle du Sud global. On s'est rendu compte que le Brésil avait mis plus l'accent sur la réforme des instituts du système financier international, de la gouvernance mondiale, alors que l'Afrique du Sud a plus mis l'accent sur la mobilisation de financement, notamment sur le climat et autres. Et la question, et ça répond aussi à la question de la dame, on voit qu'aujourd'hui, il y a une raréfaction du financement, les États-Unis se retirent, on n'est plus dans ce multilatéralisme qu'on avait au début. Est-ce que finalement, la question essentielle ne reste pas la réforme du système financier international et de la gouvernance mondiale, et sur quoi l'Afrique du Sud devait porter le plaidoyer et renforcer l'initiative du Brésil? Merci.
The reform agenda. Yeah, so your question was about the reform agenda. Okay, so I think it's going to be difficult. Si vous pouvez répéter un peu juste la question, je vais vous répondre en français.
Non, je disais juste que sur les perspectives, on s'est rendu compte que l'Afrique du Sud a plus mis l'accent sur la mobilisation de financement pour les pays africains et pour le développement économique, alors que le Brésil avait plus mis l'accent sur justement les moyens de réformer le système financier international et la gouvernance mondiale.
Oui.
Et de mon point de vue aujourd'hui, est-ce que c'est pas cela la question qui est la plus cruciale dans un contexte où aujourd'hui, par exemple, les États-Unis se retirent avec l'USAID, on a vu que c'est plus difficile aujourd'hui d'avoir du financement extérieur. Voilà, merci.
Alors, le Brésil, si on regarde par exemple au niveau des banques multilatérales de développement, le Brésil avait enclenché, c'était avant le Brésil, c'était sous la présidence italienne, le MDV Reform, c'était commencé sous la présidence italienne, ça a continué avec l'Indonésie. Le Brésil a juste mis en place des réformes qui s'appellent Better, Big and More Effect. C'est sur 12 recommandations et sur les recommandations 6, 7, 8, ce sont des recommandations par rapport à comment est-ce qu'on peut augmenter la capacité, par exemple, des banques multilatérales développent, augmenter leur capacité à octroyer des prêts. Ce que la présidence sud-africaine a fait, c'est aujourd'hui, on a instauré un mécanisme de suivi de ces réformes. Donc, toutes les banques multilatérales de développement, on a de regarder qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire, quelles sont les capacités additionnelles qu'on peut avoir pour octroyer d'autres. Et également, on avait quand même quelques initiatives. Par exemple, la réallocation des droits de tirage spéciaux vers les banques multilatérales de développement. C'est une initiative qui date depuis 2021. Si vous savez, en 2021, il y a eu une émission de 650 milliards de dollars de DTS du FMI. Et on a plaidé pour une réallocation, un réallouement de l'auteur de 100 milliards de dollars à travers 2 fonds fiduciaires qui sont logés par le FMI. Il y avait le Resilience and Sustainability Trust et le PRTT, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. Maintenant, ce qu'on veut, c'est d'avoir une partie de ces fonds alloués aux banques multilatérales de développement telles que la Banque américaine de développement ou bien la Banque interaméricaine de développement qui aujourd'hui ont le statut de détenir des DTS et qui va nous permettre avec des effets de levier. Par exemple, si on a $1 de DTS, on peut faire 3 à 4 $ de financement au minimum. Et donc aujourd'hui, parce qu'aujourd'hui, si vous levez le financement et vous le logez au FMI, c'est juste une parité 1 pour 1, alors que nous, c'est 1 pour 4. Les besoins sont énormes. Les besoins en financement de climat, on a un déficit de plus de 277 milliards de dollars. On a un déficit d'infrastructure de au moins 108 milliards de dollars par année. Ça, ce sont des genres de mécanismes qui nous permettront de combler ces déficits-là. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, faire de l'infrastructure cross-border, par exemple, faire des corridors, le Lobito corridor, si on regarde le corridor entre Abidjan et Lagos, pour faire ça, on a besoin vraiment de financement concessionnel pour bien un environnement propice pour attirer le secteur privé. Donc, l'Afrique du Sud, quand même, a pris cet engagement-là. Au niveau de l'architecture financière mondiale, on discute beaucoup de la mobilisation des ressources du privé. C'est un sujet très important. Comment est-ce qu'on peut davantage attirer le financement privé? Quel est le rôle des banques pour ça? C'est à partir des garanties. On peut faire des garanties pour que, voilà, $1 qui vient du public peut multiplier à 3 ou 4 dollars du privé. On peut également créer un environnement propice à travers faire des réformes de code d'investissement, le code des impôts et des domaines, pour pouvoir avoir un environnement attractif, pour qu'on puisse investir à long terme dans un pays. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, la difficulté d'investir en Afrique, on te dit toujours, c'est le risque politique. Parce que les politiques, peut-être, ce sont des élections à 5 ans, il y a toujours une incertitude, qu'est-ce qui va se passer une fois que le régime change. Et donc, c'est de savoir comment est-ce qu'on peut créer un environnement qui va au-delà de la tendance politique. Parce qu'un investissement pour le développement, si vous voulez réformer votre système éducatif, c'est au moins 20-25 ans. Et ça, ce n'est pas un mandat de 5 ans où vous allez résoudre ce problème. Par contre, si vous avez un environnement qui dit, sur les 25 ans, voici les priorités, et tout le monde s'engage, le privé pourra prendre le risque pays et pour mettre un financement à plus long terme. Et les banques multilatérales de développement aujourd'hui qui peuvent prêter du financement concessionnel à long terme des 30-40 ans pourront avoir davantage d'appétit. Tout ça, ça se joue. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, d'autres problèmes que nous avons, c'est également l'appétit du risque. La perception du risque est un sujet très important. On dit toujours que les agences de crédit de notation donnent, il y a toujours ce Africa Risk Premium que nous payons juste parce que nous sommes africains. Et donc, il y a un sujet pour les pays de créer cet environnement-là, de dialoguer d'une manière proactive avec les agences de crédit de notation. Également, il y a des initiatives de créer notre propre agent de notation en complémentarité. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, si vous levez le financement, plus de 40% des ressources viennent des financements extérieurs, des bonds qu'on issue de Eurobonds, qui aujourd'hui vous reviennent à des taux de rendement au-delà de 10%. Pour pouvoir réduire ça, il faut travailler proactivement avec les agences de crédit de notation. C'est ce que nous faisons au niveau de la Banque africaine de développement. À chaque réunion du FMI de la Banque mondiale, tous les groupes de la banque, des banques multilatérales de développement se réunissent et discutent avec les agences de notation. On a pu permettre d'avoir quand même des modifications sur la manière de nous classifier. Et je pense que c'est une initiative que les pays devraient faire. Et je donne un clin d'œil à Africatalis qui a également une initiative pour accompagner les pays dans ça. Donc tout ça, quand même, ce sont des réformes qui ont été mises en place bien avant, mais que l'Afrique du Sud quand même a su capitaliser. Et on espère également que ça va continuer avec la présidence américaine.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, and for the question. I don't think we'll take any other questions, but it's very clear that it's a very critical and timely discussion. At the end of the day, we're talking about this, how this really reflects to the ordinary lives. Key takeaways for me is there is the political will. It's not that there's no coordination, there is coordination, but we can have stronger coordination regionally. And I know in the beginning, Catherine had mentioned something like the Dakar Declaration. Maybe that's too far, but we might think of some of the outcomes from the event these coming days. And again, some of the key things I noted down is quarterly retreats, working with the ambassadors, working with everybody to make sure that we're on the same page. Dialogue is really quite critical. I'd like to thank you so much to my panelist, Miss Liana, South African Embassy in Senegal, and Sheikh Dian, thanks a lot for making the time. And to the audience, you've been so wonderful and engaging, and thank you. Now we have a tea break, and we'll be back, but first, a round of applause to my panelists. Thanks again. So we will take a break right now until 11:30. And after that, we'll come back for a session on shaping global solutions. from UNDP. Thanks. The ushers will show you around.
We have the crises that keep coming on. Each time even more intense because they build on the previous ones. And this discussion is really, given that context, the role of civil society. How is civil society positioning itself within that context to work with governments and make sure there's more impact? I have a panel, a prominent panel here that will help us through that discussion. We have two that are here, and we have one that is online. So as they settle down, I'd like to first introduce Madam Elizabeth, if I can say reintroduce, of SAYA. Also want to warmly welcome Dr. Ibrahim Assal of Trust Africa. And online, we have Jason Braganza. So please, if you can kindly take your seats. We sit on either side of you. Yes, because we have one that is online. So to start, do we have Jason? Is Jason online?
Hello, good afternoon. Yes, or good morning. Yes, I am.
And the organizers, UNDP, SAYA, Africa Catalyst, and other NEPAD for the invitation. They were for hosting this thing here. I think it was really a fantastic idea to have this forum in Senegal. And thank you for the honor of getting us involved in it. And I also want to say hello to everyone, to Jason online, my brother, who we've been working with a lot. I think the, you know, I asked Elizabeth earlier today how she's managing to be smiling still and looking very fit, knowing what is going on. You know, I have the privilege of being on the advisory council of the T20, and I know the amount of work that is going on now. They are already produced actually literally 100 policy briefs, 100 policy briefs. You know, the 5 working groups, each having task forces and so on. And she's one of the 3 coordinators of that whole process. So really, I think you need to be commended and saluted for what you're doing. I mean, I think, you know, Trust Africa is a Pan-African foundation and a think tank that is based here in Senegal. And we work on many of the issues. We have 3 program pillars: equitable development, democracy and governance, and African philanthropy. And in all 3, actually, we deal with some of the issues that are discussed in this context. I think it's important first of all to recognize that there are the conversations that we have heard this morning, really the introductory remarks and the first panel were excellent. And the issues have been discussed in many forums and many platforms, you know, many forums and many platforms. In June, and that has been mentioned, there was the Sevilla Financing for Development Conference. You know, next week, actually, there is the 2nd World Social Summit for Development, 30 years after the first one. That is going to happen in Doha. There's a COP coming along in less than 10 days from now, just about 10 days in Brazil. So there are many platforms, and many of these issues come. And there were, of course, the UN was celebrating its 80th anniversary in September this year. Before then, there was the Pact of the Future. So many of the big issues related to the sustainability of that, you know, climate justice, the inequalities across the world, You know, all those issues are addressed in these spaces. So what has been called non-state actors, think tanks, civil society organizations, around the G20, actually, there's a whole array of institutions and structures and frameworks, a minimum of 13 engagement groups, okay? The think tanks that she's co-leading, the business, labor, youth, women, ocean, many of them. And each one of them has working groups and are debating these issues. So what we do in our own spaces is when we meet, for example, in August in Accra with Jason Online, they organized, after that, his organization hosted the 5th, I think, what is called African Conference on Data and Development, you know, where the same issues were discussed again in June, end of August, end of July this year. Trust Africa and a couple of institutions hosted an African Philanthropy Conference in Cairo. So the point I want to make is the conversations are really very central to what African civil society and African think tanks are concerned about. And what we try to do is to provide evidence that many of the ways in which things are happening are not sustainable, are not helping to resolve the problems of the world, leading to a greater exclusion for a whole host of groups, actually putting the world at greater risk. So business as usual is admitted by everybody, you and everybody, that it's not possible. It's not an option anymore. So we have to change. So what we do, along with our partners in the think tanks community, philanthropy community, civil society, is to demonstrate that there are other ways of thinking about these issues, of approaching them, of addressing some of the big challenges that have been discussed now, ways that are more exclusive, that are much more equitable, that are actually likely to lead to greater sustainability and more secure futures for the world. So we are in these spaces. We have been participating. We are organizing some of the forums, co-organizing some of them, participating in the global forums, and we are aligned in our positions to the position of the African Union as expressed in Agenda 2063. That is our sort of reference point. And I think it's a good reference point for Africans. And in the context of the G20, and I'll stop there not to take too much time. In the context of the G20, it is about our priorities, all right. It is about Africa and the Global South's priorities. But it is more than that. I think it's an opportunity to demonstrate African leadership in ways of dealing with the global problems of the moment, starting from our own histories, our own experiences, our own values. And I think it wasn't by chance that the South Africans included the concept of solidarity in the broad theme of their own presidency. You could speak to the spirit of Ubuntu. We are saying for us, it is at the heart of our own being, of our humanity, of the values that should be governing this world. And unfortunately, concept or even of solidarity has been challenged. You know the experience of one person saying they are not going to South Africa because the South Africans are talking about solidarity. Okay, so we are in a context in which many of what characterize actually a rule-based system, things that people used to cherish and value, international cooperation, solidarity, and so on, have been challenged in big ways. So I think it was really very well informed and very wise and very bold to bring back some of those values. So we have an opportunity as Africans leading the G20 this time around under South African presidency and the African Union to give a particular African take to the way many of the challenges that have been discussed globally have been addressed.
Thank you so much for that very important perspective. Asserting Africa's leadership, not being at the periphery of discussions, but being right there. But very importantly, using research to inform them so that they're able to agree on what is working and what is not working and how that can be changed. Thank you so much, Mr. Sir. And Elizabeth, if you want me to repeat, I'll do that.
I want to, is this working? Yes. Now it's working. I want to start where you and Ibrahima ended, which is to say that it's not only about putting African issues on the agenda or solving African issues, but it's also about playing a leadership role in how we want this world to function. And this is a turning point. I mean, everybody says this has become, favorite phase. We're at a turning point. This is a crossroads. Well, it is. And yes, crossroads are not a moment in time. They're a process. But what we don't want to have to go through is a situation where, as with in 1944 and 45, when most countries in Africa didn't have their independence, they were still under colonial rule, we create a system, or we create a new system that actually still doesn't speak to our priorities as Africa, as Global South, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that that has to happen to the exclusion of other countries that are not part of it. But I think the issue of values, so South Africa's slogan, strapline, solidarity, equality, sustainability. I mean, these are values that have been hard fought and hard won over many, many decades, and lie, I think, at the heart of international cooperation. So that's the first point. It's about us being able to also determine, as you said, and make inputs into finding solutions for global challenges. The other point that is important, and this speaks more directly to, I think, your original question, which is about the role of think tanks, the role of an institution such as SIA. I think the context of the G20, the Think 20 was created about in 2012 with the Mexican presidency. It has really grown in size. As Brima mentioned, this year we've actually cut down the number of policy briefings because we didn't want to have the sort of expansive 300, 400, 500 policy briefings. But the Think 20 brings together think tanks from around the world, literally. It's not just the G20. I don't have the figures at the moment, but the number of think tanks that are involved, the number of nationalities of people involved goes beyond the 21 members. And these are all organizations and individuals who base their proposals on evidence. So there are two things, I think, when we talk about policy outcomes and recommendations. The first is we need to make sure that the policies that are being proposed actually are based in evidence. That's the first one. And then and that's our job. I think that's our job as think tanks to drive that forward. Of course, the bigger question, and this was discussed in the first session as well, is there then the political will? I think we have lots of the answers to many of our global challenges. We don't necessarily have as much political will for some of these global challenges to address them. So what the think tank, the Think 20 has done, and SIA, together with the Institute for Global Dialogue and the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, which is based at the University of Johannesburg, has brought together 5 task forces, really focusing on some of the critical issues for the South African presidency. And the intention there has been to provide recommendations based on the cutting edge research that all of these members of this think tank, and it's an open community, have undertaken. And what we, apart from the policy briefings, what we have also tried to do more of this year is also use our advisory council, on which Brima serves, to focus on a particular, perhaps sometimes more controversial or difficult topic, and actually write up notes to send through to the Sherpas, to the South African presidency early on, because as you know, the declaration is in the process of being negotiated at the moment. Our policy briefings are coming out, but you actually need to have this material in the hands of the presidency much earlier. And in July or in June, the T20, together with all the other engagement groups, had the opportunity to present a high-level summary of their recommendations at the Sherpa meeting, at the 3rd Sherpa meeting, actually physically presented a hard copy as well as speak to it. And there we've tackled some of the issues around WTO reform, around reform of the international financial architecture. And apart from the work that's being done on multilateral development banks, we have also said, we need to look at the IMF. We need to begin a reform process also in the International Monetary Fund. We've looked at the issue of insurance risk around disasters, around climate. We have looked at digital public infrastructure as an important vehicle for ensuring that Africa, that its development is actually 21st century focused. And all of these are available on our website, the T20 website. I would urge you to go to it. Just be careful, it's not the cricket. The first thing that'll come up on your Google search is the cricket. It's not the cricket, it's the other one. But please do visit that. And over the course of the next few days, we'll also be completing the upload of all the policy briefings. We've also had some of the task forces have also engaged directly with the working groups on some of these issues, specifically around development, trade, and also digital transformation. The last point I want to make, so the G20 in that sense has really been a forum that recognizes the role that think tanks can play in the development of recommendations. The last point I want to make really is that at this juncture, when everything is being questioned, both the partnerships, the actors that should be involved, etc. This is now the time more than ever that we've got to make sure that as a think tank community globally, but also as an African think tank knowledge community, we actually work together, we coordinate to make sure that there is a very, very loud voice going out there on many of the developmental issues we want on the agenda.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that. From the way you mentioned Ibrahima and the meetings you've met, you can see there's been a lot of coordination. So, so if we can just understand for those who don't, what is the link exactly with what you're doing and what he's doing? Are you coordinating overall? What is the link between what you're doing? That's the first question. The second question is in terms of data. We know that with analysis is as good as the data you get. And then we know that for African countries, in terms of data, that is, of course, a big problem. So is that something that you're also working on? So those two questions.
So with these, if I'm talking now specifically about the T20 and the G20 process, by creating the advisory council of the T20, the focus there was really to try to bring various voices, not just from Africa, but we've had a very good African representation, that creates a platform which then the different members of the advisory council can also take forward. And, it's not that everything has to be centralized. It's about informal networks that create sort of circles of cooperation. And some of these circles overlap, some of them may not, but actually because you're all in the same arena, you can actually drive forward some of the things. So you're sitting in a discussion and we are talking about the WTO. And you think actually the points that have been made here, well, why don't we do something in this part of the world or in this forum to actually drive this forward? So it's not about trying to centralize. It's really about trying to coordinate and saying, hold on, Ibrahima, you're actually planning X on this matter. We're doing something similar, but let's not use scarce resources to do the same thing. Either let's join forces or let's support you. We won't do ours. We'll provide support to you. And some of this is already happening, for example, and AfriCatalyst is also very much involved in that with the way in which we're trying as African knowledge community to coordinate around the spring and the annual meetings and the IMF and the World Bank, because we all go to Washington and UNGA and the UN General Assembly. We all go to Washington. We all have our own little events, but that dilutes the message. And I think what is important is to sort of amplify the message, not dilute it. You had another question.
On data, we know about data. Yeah.
So data. So there are different challenges. I mean, There is data collection where you're actually going out into the field. And if you're producing a report based on your research in the field, you've got that data. Then there is the other data, and that's important, right? Then you've got the other data, which is about the extent to which, say, for example, the statistics capturing in country, for example, Stats SA in South Africa or other statistical organizations are actually really primed and have the capacity and resources to collect that data, which then researchers can use. And there's been a lot of work done in that field. There's been, I think, significant recognition of its importance, and there is a degree of coordination. But I think at the end of the day, it's not a sexy thing to say, we augmented our statistical services. It doesn't win you any votes in an election. But it actually underpins your ability to govern effectively, both domestically and, of course, internationally. And so we actually need to elevate that discussion about the importance of data and statistics, because that's one of the things that is a major, I think, stumbling block for African countries. I mean, on SDGs, I think still 1/3 of the indicators we don't have data on. Indeed. So how do you develop policies? How do you assess your progress? Does it matter? If you can't count it, is it valuable? So I think there are challenges there which are not necessarily challenges that, say, the think tank community on its own can address, but certainly in our small way through the research that we undertake on the ground, that's critical.
Okay. Thank you so much. The importance of data, obviously, like we said, it's just as, the analysis we do, if the data is, the quality of the data, it can be even there, but sometimes the quality of it. So that is something. And obviously, we've mentioned AI, technology, leveraging on AI to even collect this data. That I think going forward, that is something we can think about. I'm happy to ask Jason the same question, the role of your organization. Let me also say, Jason, before you come in, that we know that there are people online who have joined us. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. We have colleagues here who are monitoring the chat. So Jason, over to you. What's the role of your organization in these processes?
Great, thank you so much.
And welcome virtually to Senegal.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having Aphrodite. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting Aphrodite to be part of this very important conversation, and also to SAIA, UNDP, AfriCatalyst, and AUDA NEPAD for organizing this very timely conversation of just a few weeks to the G20 summit. I think first and foremost, Aphrodite in its full form stands for the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. We're a Pan-African civil society organization that does advocacy on transparency, accountability, good governance on public debt, both from a borrower's perspective and more recently from a lender's perspective, but also tries to have an intersectional approach to the issues of public debt, so that we don't just look at it in isolation as an instrument of finance, but also as an instrument of development and an instrument that can catalyze social, economic, and transformation of the continent. And so we do try to also present a Pan-African perspective to how we look at the issue of public debt on the continent, given that the crises that we are currently facing globally, the effects and the impact are invariably more deeper and wider on the African continent. Many of our African countries are allocating quite a big amount of their very limited resource purse to debt servicing than they are to other development and socioeconomic sectors. And so this is what Aphrodite does as an organization. We also do a lot of convening, as Comrade Ibrima mentioned. We're also very proud to have hosted one of the African conferences on debt and development in Dakar, Senegal, a couple of years ago, together with Trust Africa and AfriCatalyst. So that convening power that brings together think tanks in the shape of AfriCatalyst, philanthropic African philanthropy leaders in Trust Africa and civil society organizations like AFRODAD together to try and really advocate internally for solutions that emanate from the continent and not just templating what is already out there. And I think I want to build on 2 points that have already been mentioned. One is that this has been such a pivotal year for Africa as a continent, the institutions, organizations that are involved in shaping both the narrative of how debt and development finance is conducted, both on the continent and internationally, but also how we've been able to shape some of the ongoing conversations, in a very collaborative way in terms of getting coherent and consistent messaging. And here I want to pay a very special tribute and appreciation to the role that the African Union Commission has played in this regard. And let me begin with the first one. If we start with the conversation around the Financing for Development conference that took place in Sevilla, Spain, just a few months ago, and how important the African voice was in shaping that outcome document, not just on debt, but on issues of taxation as well, issues of ODA, trade, and non-unilateral measures. The Africa group within the United Nations played a very pivotal role, and I'm glad to see that we had Ambassador Chola joining and be part of this program, because under his leadership of being part of that coordinating group and leadership group of the FFD drafting team for the outcome document, there was a real sense that the Global South, led by the Africa group, was going to achieve something quite monumental. And getting the type of language that we got on debt, including such things like an intergovernmental process on discussing reforming the debt architecture, the protection of the tax negotiations that are currently ongoing for the establishment of a UN international tax convention, I think really show how important civil society, African governments, think tanks, and academia can be in shaping the global discourse on the global financial architecture. We are no longer bystanders and yes people in these negotiations, but actually the shapers at a time when those negotiations were about to fall apart. And I must say, a lot of that achievement was met following the very timely first ever Pan-African Conference on Debt hosted by the African Union Commission in Lomé, Togo, that gave us the Lomé Declaration. That document gave us the impetus, particularly the Africa Group, to hold its head very high in negotiating a very strong outcome document. And that outcome document is now what is being used to inform a lot of what is being discussed at the T20 level, what is being discussed at the G20 level, the Ministerial and Finance Working Group, is how to actualize some of those proposals. Things like improving the G20 Common Framework, the introduction of an extended debt service suspension initiative, the ideas of public debt registries, or things like debt still clauses, the Jubilee Commission, the Africa Expert Group, the cost of capital. All of those issues came out of a document that was being discussed at the United Nations level, at a technical level, at a diplomatic level. And what we want now is to see, how important that is. And I think, as a group, as a collective, civil society, academia, think tanks, and member states have really shown from the continent how important this collaboration is. Now, the second point I want to just illustrate on why this remains critical for our discussion is that when we have collaborated, when we've brought together civil society, think tanks, African philanthropy organizations to think through what should be the sharp end of our agenda, we've seen actually we can turn the tide on many of these conversations. At a time when the world is at flux, I think the initiatives, the work that's being done under the T20, the briefing notes for the presidency, I think is extremely important because that's what's going to be very crucial in informing the declaration that comes out in a few weeks' time when the heads of state meet in South Africa. But the second point is, and here again, the point around the inclusion and the space that is being created, and particularly by the African Union Commission, to bring civil society, think tanks, academia, and other interest groups into the conversation under the South Africa's presence of the G20, but also within the African Union Commission's processes, the Specialized Technical Committee, for example, is extremely important, because this is where we have the brainstorming of great ideas, great initiatives that can actually be then taken forward and be part of a continental package in these very important political spaces, such as the G20, such as the UN process. But it also binds and provides this collective dimension that sometimes when you go out there into these international negotiations, people say that the Africa group is not coordinated, or there isn't coherence. But I think the opening up of this space by the African Union Commission and specifically the directorate that is headed by Dr. Olomo, who's on the call in this meeting, I think needs to be an example of how bringing together great minds of this continent can yield very good results. And at a time when there's a lot of skepticism around collaboration, around civil society, around think tanks, I think there are some really good examples where this can work and you really yield positive results in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for seeing a gap, which is the coordination of African countries on debt issues and then uniting them in terms of the different stakeholders who are working on it. I think that's an excellent point, but I am curious to ask a follow-up question. We had this morning from Honorable Yana from South Africa that one of the key areas is to maybe move away from debt and talk about other issues, not totally relying on debt, but then talking about other issues. So but the debt is there, we still need to talk about it. So I just want to know the thrust of your discussion with these coordinating bodies that you're working with. What is the key thrust? When you're talking about debt, what angle are you approaching it from?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can't hide away from the issue of debt, because at present, many African countries are opting to do debt servicing than they are investments in public investments in infrastructure, energy, health, education, and so on. And so, you can't ignore this, and it also, it adds to the outflows if you consider other things like illicit financial flows, when you think about tax incentives, tax holidays. All of these combinations add to the outflows that are leaving the continent, leaving many governments with deficits, which have to then be filled with more borrowing, right? So it's very difficult for us to ignore the very vicious cycle our different types of economic structures or financial incentives or financial instruments tend to leave the gaps that then force governments to borrow. I think what is also important is the governance of how debt is being managed, borrowed, and utilized. I think there has been a lot of conversations on the borrower side. Are countries borrowing responsibly? Are they transparent in how they utilize the money that they use, that they borrow? Are they getting returns of investment on investments? We also need to look at the lenders. Are lenders giving money in the correct way? In Senegal, we're just I know we're dealing with this new hidden debt that has been unveiled. How did the lenders lend to a country when they were not aware that this was not being done in the correct way? So there needs to be a responsibility on the governance side of things, because these types of things, when they come up to the surface, affect things like credit ratings. So we also need to look at credit rating agencies, because many of our governments are afraid of falling foul of credit rating agencies because the cost of borrowing becomes more expensive. So when you think of all of these in this entire ecosystem, it also affects your domestic resource mobilization ability, because you're forced into what I generally tend to call lazy taxation. Lazy taxation means that you go into regressive taxes, you go into consumption taxes in order to raise revenues to fill the gaps. Or you continue borrowing in a vicious cycle way from international capital markets that are extremely expensive, extremely short term. Or you end up spending your domestic resource mobilization for government operations and not investment operations. So when you're talking about debt, yes, we do need to look at the debt ecosystem, but we also need to look at how it is affecting the domestic resource mobilization agenda on the continent. How are we going to transform our economies if we're not able to address the domestic resource complexity that we have when it comes to the debt problem that many of our countries are facing?
Thank you so much, Jason, for that insight. I would like to ask this set of questions. We've talked about the fragmentation and how you are actually working to overcome that through your coordination, working together as non-state actors. But then there's also fragmentation at the level of the G20, financing for development and COP processes. So the question is, how can non-state actors bridge fragmentation across these forums to promote coherent policy as? Elizabeth.
So I think, firstly, we need to recognize our own limitations, right? We're not all, non-state actors are not all powerful. Some might be, but they're the big tech companies. But I mean, from our side, the issue, and this is the biggest challenge, not just for non-state actors, think tanks, etc., but also for governments, is that there are so many processes happening which are also interrelated. But you sometimes have different ministries working in different, taking the lead in different forums. And this is where you have sometimes the dissonance. So in the UNFCCC, you have the climate or the environmental ministries. You need to have your finance guys there as well. In the financing for development, who was leading the conversation? It was in our case, it was Turco. But you actually need to also have a number of other agencies there. So there's that issue. And then making sure that, of course, across all of these, we're actually talking the same language. So that the positions the African Union or South Africa take on debt in the G20 resonates in the positions we take the financing for development, or in the IMF discussions, the World Bank discussions, and so on and so forth. And that is a big challenge. And I think, and we shouldn't hit ourselves too hard on that. It's a human problem. Okay. But, we've got to try. So it is really about saying, like we've done with debt, and Jason referred to it. I mean, the Lomé outcome on debt, that should not be standing alone. That is what we take into the G20. That is what we take into the IMF. We take into the discussions, we've done the financing for development. We take it into discussions with our creditors and so on. And we try at least to have a framework where we're all working together, even though there will need to be specificities in each country's dealing with the debt challenge. It's very difficult. I mean, even the European Union, which has supranational authority on some issues like trade, I think finds it really difficult to aim high to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So you end up with the lowest common denominator sometimes. And that's something we have to be really careful of, or we have to manage. We can't avoid, but we have to manage, and we have to see where we can make breakthroughs. I mean, from a think tank community or a non-state actor perspective, it is important that we're probably not going to agree on everything. You're not going to get civil society actors to agree with business actors on particular things. we see that also with the various engagement groups in the G20. We've got a business 20, we've got a labor 20, we've got a civil society 20. But there are things we probably can agree on. And if we identify what these things are and we work coherently then in a coordinated fashion, where you've got business actually saying the same thing as labor or civil society on particular aspects, whether that is on infrastructure. For example, this year the B20 has focused on infrastructure and finance. They've focused on trade and investment. How do we get the African continental free trade area going? They've looked at digital transformation and the importance of digital public infrastructure like we've done. Now, there are areas there that we can really push jointly. And I think that's becoming even more important at this particular juncture. But the constraint is that at the end of the day, the non-state actors can do so much, and then the state needs to take over.
That's a practical way of looking at it. It's a process. Yeah, it's a process to be worked on. And maybe I'll ask Salah, Dr. Salah, what is your take on that in terms of fragmentation within the global processes? What the role of non-state actors?
Well, thank you. I think I'll just take it up from where Elizabeth and some of the points that Jason was raising. I think the fragmentation is unavoidable. Okay, but if you say it's a process, the process is actually extremely important. It's probably as important as the outcomes, because what happens in the process is all these conversations, deep engagements, among the actors on all different issues, and actually you have some of these things continue well beyond. At the end of the day, how much of all these things that are coming from the engagement groups ends in the final outcome document of the G20? Very little. Very little, because just imagine you have at minimum 13 engagement groups, each producing so much, each trying to push its own agenda, and some of the agendas are actually contradictory, And in addition, the countries themselves maybe having different kinds of sensitivities, different priorities, and so on. So I think we push as much as possible, but we make sure that we create the conditions for what we value is protected and is pushed going forward in the different platforms and different forums. And I think the point about what happened ahead of the Sevilla conference that Jason was making was very important. Similarly, we know how much Africa has influenced the SDGs, because we had the advantage of having had Agenda 2060 developed before the SDG summit. And we went there with a common position, and the SDGs actually carried a lot from what came from Africa. So the processes are very, very important. Particularly, I come back to an earlier conversation in the previous panel. I think the questions about what will happen next year are genuine questions. They are genuine concerns. Because if some people are asking whether the constituency for some of the issues that we are pushing is really very strong within the US itself. Okay, so if you have American think tank, civil society, and some part of the business sector that are also aligned in their positions and their views with some of the things that were expressed in the South. It would be fantastic, but we are not sure about that. Okay, so the question about what how Brazil built upon what India and the others established already, how South Africa is trying to build upon what Brazil has started, and what will happen to that, it's a really, really important question. So I think it makes the question of again developing mechanisms for these conversations to continue, for the engagement to continue, not only within the G20 process, but also in these other forums where the G20 meets others as well, around the UN, for example. And I think it's also important to see among the maybe strongest players within the G20 who are really potential allies, if I may put it that way, who can sort of be advocates, be the voice, who can relay some of the concerns and the interests coming from Africa and elsewhere in that particular forum, because they sit at the table and in spaces where we are not. So it's a combination of factors, I think, to overcome that fragmentation, to come back to the point you are making. For us in Africa, and I think the point was also made earlier on, And Elizabeth just made it again. We need to really invest in building that ACFTA as a space and as a community, you know, in a very strong way. Take it very seriously, you know, and make sure that, you know, whatever happens, you know, we don't lose that sort of in view. And I think at the end of the day, that's where the future of it, and strengthen South-South collaborations also, you know, because if something may happen, some of these things may fall along the way after the next presidency, but then it will somehow come back to hopefully. However, I think what we are hearing and we are seeing is that the big disruption that has occurred is not likely to be repaired in anytime soon. Okay, so the move away from particular conceptions about international cooperation, solidarity, and so on, these are deep shifts. So we better prepare ourselves, you know, for how do we maybe take the opportunity to again strengthen ourselves in our own spaces, in our own systems, and be a much more powerful voice in these negotiations going forward. I think we are better off again going together, having common positions, but also implementing what we say in the common positions, not only for having them for the purposes of negotiations, but also making sure that they are relayed, and that is where again non-stakeholders and civil society can play a role, is to bring the issues back to the countries, to bring them back to our communities, so that they can be followed as well at that level.
Thank you for that comprehensive response in terms of having common positions and making sure that they implemented back at the country level. You know, I enjoy when researchers talk because they talk and they ask questions at the same time. And you asked a question that I would like maybe Jason to answer it. He mentioned that we have these discussions, but few of it actually is reflected in the outcome documents. And I know that civil non-state actors have actually made some headway in making sure that the Africa position is well had. But I want Jason, what is your perspective of that? Are we really influential, and what can we do differently?
No, I think we definitely are influencers.
Yes,
and I think we must not underestimate. I don't know, can you hear me? Sorry.
If Jason is not there, Elizabeth, you want to try? You take it a go. Yeah.
So I'm going to use an example that occurred this year, not formally in the engagement groups, but using sort of input from think tanks, from experts, researchers, etc. We were quite involved with the development working group processes where they identified 3 priorities. The one was on global public goods, which was a very controversial topic. The second one was on social protection, universal floors for all. And the third was on illicit financial flows, the point that Jason raised. And in all 3 of those, the way in which the development working group took those priorities forward was firstly, in the first instance, to actually reach out to think tanks, to experts, and say, hey, you know, given what the development working group has done over the last, has focused on, and what South Africa has identified as important, you know, what do you think? You know, what should be the priorities? They had some ideas, and you know, and so they brought in the knowledge partners to help co-create and develop the concept notes for that. In the same time, actually being quite innovative in putting some issues on the table that were going to be controversial. They knew it was going to, the global public goods debate, which is really about saying there are certain things that are global public goods. They should not be funded by development cooperation. If development cooperation is intended to go to developing countries to help with their development, you know, the issues of climate, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a declaration on that, but we do have a chair's summary on that, which is nevertheless important. But I want to focus on the IFF specifically, where there was one of, you know, I think one of the top experts on illicit financial flows in Africa, who was actually very involved both developing that, working together with the relevant agencies. And we now have a call to action on illicit financial flows that was actually adopted by all in the development working group, and which I'm sure will make its way into the leaders' declaration. It's not the perfect outcome we would have wanted. We probably would have wanted something that sort of makes some very concrete statements on illicit financial flows, including the ones who are the recipients of these illicit financial flows. But it doesn't matter. We've moved the agenda forward. And the point here about non-state actors is that real partnership between government and non-state actors, recognizing where the strengths and the synergies can potentially be. And that was an example. And there are many others. Certainly in the G20 space this year, I think a number of think tanks, both involved in the T20 process or outside it, have really played an important role in sort of helping to shape and outcomes based on their evidence.
One small point to that thing about illicit. You know, it's really massive what we're talking about, illicit financial flows, and so stopping them would really make a difference. And the African Common Position on illicit financial flows, there's also it's actually more specific, like on asset recovery, the trillions that have been lost over the years. How do we make sure that we get even a fraction of those trillions back? And it's where there isn't much progress happening so far. So the battle about something needing to be done to stop them, to stop the flows, I think that battle has been won in the sense that nobody queries it anymore. We agree that we are losing so much. You can pay for health, education, or pay for transformation because you are losing so much. At least it's an opportunity that's missed. But what has been going on for so long? And I think the closest that they've got to maybe approaching it slightly differently now is when the African Union said, maybe we need to be talking about reparations and see that they've not only been depriving us of resources that we could have used, but the resources are not coming back, number one. Number two, you add the illicit, as Jason was saying, what is lost through illicit financial flows, what is lost through servicing a debt. That is actually, people are querying, think tanks and civil society are querying the legitimacy of the debt, and just seeing how it is making everything difficult. I think it is one of the greatest challenges today to African development is the debt that is weighing so heavily. About 22 countries that are literally distressed or getting to a point of being distressed or nearly being distressed by the debt. It's a challenge to democracy. You elect a democratic government, then it finds itself incapable of getting the resources it needs to support services, to create jobs and so on. So it's a big problem in so many different aspects.
Thank you. For me, one of the key things I'm learning really, and that is just the magnificence of the work that non-state actors does. These people are on a daily basis, working to fight for us, if I can say that, us meaning Africa, through research, through consultations on the ground, through coordination, among themselves. Enormous work on difficult issues, whether it is governance, the effect of climate change, immigration, trade issues, very difficult topics. And they're finding evidence to make our argument easier for things to change at the very top of this global discussion. So can we just give them a round of applause before we go into questions and answers? Now the floor is open. Do we have any questions? Yes, I note a hand there, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stuart Fegu, and I am an intern at Africatalyst. I'll first start by thanking you all for your insights, and it was very nice and valuable. So Ms. Elizabeth talked about data, and that struck me because as a young statistician, I am far aware that in order to address Africa's problems, we need quality data to provide data evidence-based solutions. So I have a two-in-one question. So it goes like, what capacity building support is required for local non-state actors to strengthen their data collection analysis for more trustworthiness? And second, what concrete mechanisms can assure that locally sourced data and insights from non-state actors are not just collected and used internally, but equally integrated, for example, at the G20 level decision-making? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have another question? Yes.
Thanks to all the speakers for all the great inputs. Listening to the first session, I mean, I was a bit worried that we're talking more about the global processes, and I guess that's what we are doing. But when you look at that session, there were questions around how the global engagements impact, issues on the ground, So from my theories of change, I would say that, your global engagements are further away from the, grassroots level. And that's why we kind of, struggle to articulate the impact on the ground. Now, I like the interventions that Jason has brought in, because what he has, done is really to show that, as much as it's important to engage at the global forum, there are things that we need to be addressing as, as the African, continent. Now, my question is, again, borrowing from some of the issues that came out from the morning session, is around, capacity limitations. So how do we balance that, the engagement at the global processes, but making sure that we do not forget what needs to be done on the African, on the African continent? I mean, the issues of domestic resource mobilization is not just from the mobilization part of it. It is even, issues around the utilization of the resources once they have been, mobilized. So issues of corruption that are going on the continent, how non-state actors can make sure that, we remind our, our policymakers, not just to, to pass the blame to, to your global leaders, but also taking responsibility that there's much that they too can do to move, the development agenda of the continent.
Okay, thank you so much. We have 3 excellent questions. Maybe we can start with those, and based on time, we can see if we can take another round. Yes, exactly. Jason, are you with us?
Hello, yes, I am. I don't know if you can
Jason?
hear me. Can you hear me? Hello?
Great. Yes, we can hear you. Did you hear the questions?
Yes, I did.
Okay. You may go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the questions that have been asked, and as well to Elizabeth and Imbrima for their contributions as well. I think it's very important to appreciate what exactly this particular G20 summit can achieve for the continent. We have a huge opportunity, particularly with the African Union Commission being part of the full discussions and full negotiations, that we really try and push the envelope and the boundary here, particularly for the continent. So, for instance, I think at a very practical level, the point that Elizabeth made around illicit financial flows is a good one, but you cannot have that, but not have something on debt that is substantive. And so I hope this forum this week in Dakar will also have that energy and that impetus to take a message to that that needs to be integrated into the outcome document and the declaration, that there needs to also be something quite substantive on debt, because without dealing with these two things, you cannot then deal with the issues of domestic resource mobilization. I also just wanted to make up an additional point around how relevant and important the collaboration between academia, think tanks, civil society organizations can be and have been in actually pushing the boundary. The current negotiations on the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation actually started in Africa, in South Africa to be more specific. The high-level panel on illicit financial flows that was chaired by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki provided the baseline or the foundation for a conversation on how to reform the international tax system and how to redefine the topic or the issue of illicit financial flows. And all of that came and stemmed from the African continent, civil society organizations, government, legislators, think tanks, and academia. And today we are discussing how to change the tax system, global tax system, because of that conversation that started on the continent, right? We're talking about not just the technical definitions of how taxation should be done, but the political imperative of moving away from a group-based, the OECD-based, where it is a crony system, to a more democratic space under the auspices of the United Nations, that where African governments and governments from developing countries more generally have an equal voice. Now, this is quite important, and I do want us, as we think about the G20 and the importance that we now, as having a seat as the African Union Commission, together with South Africa, the opportunity that we have, not just in the South African presidency this year, but I think I heard it being mentioned in the opening session about the Troika, looking at the future presidencies of the G20. How can we begin to strategize to change, continue changing and advocating for changing the international system based on our lived realities on the continent, right? The illicit financial flows was a very clear one. The debt crisis is also a very clear one. I heard you mention something around artificial intelligence. How do we start preparing ourselves for ensuring we are making the rules at the global level based on our lived realities on the continent, and that we do not get swept aside and put aside? I think the think tanks like Africatalyst, ASEP, and many assets and many others across the continent are doing amazing work in pushing the boundaries on how we can innovate and provide progressive ways of and advisory ways so that we can change our economies, but also where the funding can come from, and the role of civil society in ensuring that the citizens are not left behind in this conversation and are part and parcel of this discussion, I think is extremely important. So I just wanted to add these 2 or 3 points to the discussion, that what is happening in Dakar today and tomorrow should not end just in 2025, but really should be the impetus for what we do in 2026. But in particular, I think 2027 is where we're likely to see greater fruits from the harvest that we're putting in. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. For those reflections, very important, very pertinent. On the questions that were asked, maybe Ibrahim, if you can just take a look on those ones. The capacity building for data, as well as the measures to ensure that data is used.
Thank you very much. I think that's really a great question. I think data, it's, first of all, it's not always available where it is needed. The available data may not be of the quality that is required. And so those are important. And so there is data. I think Elizabeth made this point. We also should be actually very clear about what we are talking about and what is within our capacity as non-state actors. So you can do research, you can generate data as an institution, as a research center. But the bulk of the work around data is done by the statistics departments. The South Africa has a huge infrastructure for that. Senegal has, and so there are, go outside of Senegal, in France is insane, that produces the greatest amount of data. So and that is also a problem because in many countries, that apparatus is not functioning well. So I think it's there are certain things that are at that level, and there are things that have to do with enhancing the capacities of think tanks and CSOs for them to be able to document much more effectively what they are doing, collect data, generate research, and so on. So I think you are really spot on. It requires thinking. It requires, I think, different kinds of mechanisms also of financing that process. That's often where our governments are not also helping, because the organizations are left on their own to try to get funding from one philanthropy or the other, one foundation or the other. And there is no mechanism for accessing funds to address those capacity issues. And I think that is something to say. While I have the mic, do you want to clarify one point I made? I mean, when I was asking the question of how much of what is being prepared by all these engagement groups ends up in the final declaration, I didn't in any kind of way mean that it is not important. It's an important platform, it's an important opportunity. Yes. We need to engage it, we need to do all that we can. And in some instances, people have succeeded actually in influencing the outcome documents in a big way, as happened in Sevilla, and as has happened in other platforms. As I said also, even in the SDGs, there was that input. But the point is, it should not be our only ambition to say, we're getting 2 or 3 lines of a paragraph in the paragraph of the outcome document, and we think we have achieved everything. No, we should. I think all the amount of work and investment that has gone into producing the policy briefs, notes and so on, actually should be of use for policy, for public debates, long after the event itself, and that is the only way to make sure that what we are producing now also is not lost if you have a change in priorities or a change in the presidency of the G20, for example. So that's why it's just a way of preserving and giving us ourselves the possibility of really continuing and preserving the things that are of value that come out of this great amount of work.
Well noted. Well noted. And Elizabeth, I just don't want the last question not to be answered. If you can take that one, in terms of how to maintain a balance between the global process and what we have on the ground, to make sure that that advocacy at the global process, like for instance, you're advocating at the global process, but then in terms of data, there is a problem with data. How do you make sure that the things at the global, that's just an example, it could be on other areas as well. How do you make sure that what is on the discussion at the global level is actually quite reflective of the challenges at the ground level?
Yeah, I mean, I think that has to go without saying. And, you have to do both. As I like to say to my colleagues, you got to walk and chew gum at the same time. But not to make it too light a point about it. I mean, it is critical. And it's, so when we're having the discussions, for example, around African credit rating, the credit rating agencies and the problems we face, we should also be reflecting that in order to deal with the credit rating agencies, you also, and the unfair cost of capital issue, you've actually also got to make sure that, you are doing everything you need to do to not create the kinds of perceptions which fuel some of the problems in the existing framework. So it's fundamental. And I mean, it goes back to the way in which the AU also began to engage on the issue of governance 20 odd years ago, more than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, on the African peer review mechanism. It recognized that if we're wanting to attract flows of finance flows from elsewhere in the world, we also need to do things to address our governance framework. So it's never easy, but it's there. We're doing it. Some are doing it better than others, but it's definitely not an either or. It really has to
be both.
Yeah.
And it is reiterative also, back and forth, so that you know, that is there. Thank you so much. Time is almost up. I think about this thing is time. Can I have just 2 minutes for them to say their final words? 30 seconds. Yeah, please. Jason, can we have final words from you? Just 30 seconds.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think 30 seconds. Very important. Think tanks, civil society organizations, non-state actors are actually the engine of transformation and change, nationally, regionally, continentally, and globally. All these initiatives that we're discussing, even some of them in the G20, have emanated from civil society actions, from think tank recommendations and research. So I think that coordination and close collaboration should continue. And I do hope that from this meeting, we'll be able to take something back to South African government on illicit financial flows, on debt, that is more progressive and will push the needle to connect the dots with the Lome Declaration and with the Compromiso from Sevilla. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ibrahima?
Thank you very much. I think once again to say, just to again to commend the people leading some of these engagement groups that are doing an extraordinary amount of work, and thank for the organizers for doing this. I think there's a lot to learn from the holding of the G20. The closer one looks at it, the more actually we should be looking at just even the structure and the process. I've said this in a meeting I was at, I think it was last week. The day that the African Union succeeds in getting engagement groups like those around the G20 to be engaging with it, that day Africa will be moving much faster and in a much more important way. Think about it. The business community, labor, women, young people, you know, parliamentary justice, all these groups engaging structurally ahead of every AU summit, saying the summit is going to come, even if you do it once a year. The summit is coming, this is the agenda of the summit. How do we influence the agenda? What are the issues that we want the AU to think about? And you have the conversations in the country. When we begin doing that, I think the African integration process will be moving forward in a much more important way. So for me, there is also that interest in how just the process is happening and what we can learn from it and reach our own systems and ways of doing things.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, you have the final word.
I think the lesson we have learned from all of these processes and the way in which civil society engages is that it takes time, but you've just got to stick it out. It's and and there will be, you know, you will make 2 steps forward and maybe sometimes 3 steps back, but then 5 steps forward. And I think we've just got to keep at it. Particularly now that, you know, you may not see results in the way that you want today, but you've got to sow the seeds for the future, and you've got to build on what you've done in the past. And the illicit financial flows is a brilliant example. I mean, and I take Jason's point about the integration of the two. But this discussion was put on the G20 agenda by South Africa in 2015. It's taken 10 years to get it to a point where the Development Working Group has a declaration on it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. At the UNDP, we like to say that in terms of development, we like to sow the seeds. So when you talk about sowing the seeds in civil society, with non-state actors, I can see your point. The process is not easy. It requires endurance because you are actually going into uncharted waters. Things are difficult, but then you have to keep at it. So the discussion today has been really a good eye-opener on, especially on debt. Yes, we need to talk about that, but also not to just talk about forgive the debt, but then channel the discussion to outflows, how it is affecting resource mobilization, talk about terms of lending, talk about credit rating, you know, and also how it is affecting basically domestic resource mobilization. We've talked about the importance of data. Non-state actors need to influence. They need to then therefore provide evidence for that influence. And if they don't have that data, especially the quality data they need, the results may be actually misleading in the end. So data, but also harnessing on AI, you know, to provide, you know, this data. So we've talked about building, you know, the free trade, Africa free trade, continental free trade area, you know, and important point has been made in terms of the G20. we have all parties who could influence that. So we're talking to a broad party, broad base of stakeholders who can actually influence. And yes, it is difficult at the beginning. Yes, we have to knock and sometimes knock again and knock again, but we have to persevere. And in the end, we will make impact that will affect and uplift Africa and the people in Africa. With that, I'd like to close this session. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much to the panelists and our session. Fatu, thank you so much for leading the session so well, and to the panelists for making time, and those online for keeping with us. Now we move on to the next part that is in between our lunch and now. So we request for your presence. And that's a presentation from UNDP, a research report on debt sustainability in West Africa. I'll hand over to you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Ousseynou Ndoye. Je suis économiste au niveau du PNUD Bureau au Sénégal. Et je vais vous faire la présentation de cette étude qui porte sur repenser le financement pour le développement en Afrique. Et bon, j'aurais aimé faire la présentation en anglais. Je vais être le seul qui va... Bon, heureusement que Catherine m'a rassuré qu'il y a eu le représentant du ministère qui a parlé français comme moi. Donc, je pense que d'après les discussions qui sont revenues depuis ce matin, il y a quand même quelque chose qui revient, c'est qu'il est important pour les pays africains d'avoir une ligne commune dans le cadre de cette plaidoirie pour améliorer le financement des pays pour le financement de leur développement. Et cette étude s'inscrit dans ce cadre puisqu'il s'agit d'une contribution en termes d'analyse et de diagnostic des défis communs auxquels les pays africains font face et identifier également les potentielles opportunités par rapport auxquelles ces pays-là, pour les Africains, peuvent se positionner pour améliorer le cadre de financement de leur développement. Et cette étude a été réalisée au niveau de l'unité prospective analyse stratégique du PNUD, mais également il y a eu l'appui des collègues du siège dans le cadre de l'amélioration des résultats de cette étude. Donc, pour aller directement à cette étude, donc, comme je le disais tantôt, il s'agit donc de faire un diagnostic en partant sur ce qui a été discuté tout à l'heure, les données quantitatives, essayer de voir quels sont les défis communs auxquels les pays africains font face et comment identifier des opportunités et identifier également des pistes de recommandation pour aller vers cette ligne d'action commune des pays africains. Donc, d'abord, je présente le contexte parce qu'aujourd'hui, il est clair qu'en Afrique, on a une croissance, d'après les prévisions du FMI, qui montre qu'on a une croissance résiliente parce que malgré les chocs, on arrive encore à faire des croissances positives, mais cette croissance-là reste relativement faible pour pouvoir tirer significativement les populations de la pauvreté. En effet, je pense, c'est revenu ce matin, la dimension démographique constitue encore un âge de taille. On n'arrive pas encore à exploiter le dividende qui est offert par notre population et ceci fait qu'on n'arrive pas à doubler notre PIB par tête. Mais également, au-delà de ces enjeux internes, il y a également les chocs externes auxquels font face les pays africains. Pour rappel, il y a eu la COVID-19 en 2020, mais également il y a les crises aujourd'hui géopolitiques qui affectent l'environnement international. Il y a également la volatilité des prix des matières premières qui font que également le système de financement des pays africains devient de plus en plus fragilisé. Et au-delà de ça, également, il y a Aujourd'hui, on le constate tous que maintenant les bailleurs se retirent de plus en plus dans le financement de l'aide publique au développement. Et tous ces facteurs-là constituent aujourd'hui des éléments qui font qu'il est impératif pour les pays africains de voir comment améliorer le cadre de financement de leur développement en se basant sur des ressources domestiques, mais également sur des ressources innovantes. Et pour mettre quelques chiffres sur ce contexte en termes de diagnostic, aujourd'hui, comme je disais tout à l'heure, les prévisions du FMI dans le cadre en termes de perspective montrent qu'à moyen terme, l'Afrique a un niveau de croissance économique relativement stable et résiliente, autour de 4 à 4,5, de 3,5 à 4,3% de croissance. Néanmoins, comme je le disais tantôt, cette croissance-là reste relativement faible parce que si on compare les pays africains par rapport aux autres pays dans le reste du monde, comme en Asie par exemple, sur les 10 dernières années, on voit que ces pays asiatiques ont réussi à presque doubler leur PIB par tête. On a une variation de presque 80% de leur PIB par tête. Là où nous, on n'arrive pas encore à faire décoller ce PIB par tête-là. Et c'est ça qui fait qu'on a une faible capacité encore à réduire significativement le niveau de pauvreté dans nos pays. Mais également en termes de fiscalité, de mobilisation des ressources internes. Aujourd'hui, les résultats montrent, selon le rapport qui a été réalisé déjà récemment par l'OCDE, on arrive faiblement à capter les ressources fiscales, surtout sur la partie fiscalité, puisqu'on n'arrive pas encore à identifier les niches fiscales sur lesquelles on peut récupérer des ressources. Et au-delà de cette capacité à identifier ces niches, il y a également la problématique de la maîtrise des données pour pouvoir mieux quantifier la capacité de mobilisation des ressources. Et ça fait qu'aujourd'hui, on est à 15,6% de mobilisation des recettes, là où dans les autres zones au niveau du monde, comme dans le cadre de l'Union européenne, on est à 34% de mobilisation des ressources fiscales. En termes de dépenses publiques également, mobiliser des ressources, c'est très bien, mais comment les dépenser également, c'est une problématique. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, on a des rigidités qui font qu'aujourd'hui, les États africains continuent à subventionner une bonne partie des dépenses. Je prends l'exemple des dépenses en énergie, l'électricité, par exemple, le cas du Sénégal. En 2022, cette subvention représentait 4% de notre PIB. Et donc, ça, c'est ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, même après que les États arrivent à mobiliser des ressources, l'utilisation reste problématique. Et souvent, on a des problèmes à mettre des réformes pour permettre de réduire ces subventions-là. En 2023, le ministère des Finances avait mis en place une feuille de route avec comme objectif, pour le cas du Sénégal, toujours, avec comme objectif en 2025 d'arrêter carrément cette subvention. Mais aujourd'hui, on n'arrive pas encore à mettre carrément ces réformes-là en œuvre. Et des exemples existent. Aujourd'hui, on a le cas du Nigeria, le cas de l'Angola, qui montrent qu'on a encore des difficultés pour mettre en place ces réformes. Au-delà des dépenses publiques, il y a également la problématique qui revient tout le temps, la question de la dette. Aujourd'hui, si on regarde les tendances depuis les 10 dernières années, parce qu'il est important également de revoir comment on évolue par rapport aux autres. Parce qu'on voit que l'Afrique, aujourd'hui, a un taux de croissance de la dette qui est beaucoup plus rapide comparé aux autres zones dans le monde. Aujourd'hui, on est à plus de 61% avec des pays qui ont dépassé les 100%, comme le Sénégal, aujourd'hui. Et une autre tendance qu'on constate, c'est que les pays les plus endettés, souvent, ont encore cette tendance à augmenter le ratio d'endettement. Et c'est les pays qui sont les moins endettés qui ont des tendances à la baisse de ce ratio d'endettement. Et quand on diagnostique même la structure de cette dette-là, le constat revient toujours que ces pays les plus endettés ont une structure d'endettement qui n'est pas favorable pour réduire, parce qu'il y a une bonne partie de cette dette qui est constituée de dettes privées. Alors que dans la partie des pays les moins endettés, le constat est qu'il y a un recours plus accru au financement multilatéral ou au financement bilatéral. Et donc, ceci fait que aujourd'hui, cette structure de la dette fait que la dette souveraine est souvent mal notée. Parce qu'on a déjà 9 pays sur 10 qui sont classés comme spéculatives. Donc, ce qui fait qu'au-delà du ratio d'endettement, la qualité de la dette s'en trouve également être affectée puisque le coût de l'endettement devient plus élevé. Et enfin, en termes de commerce, c'est pas bon, the last but not the least, en termes de commerce, aujourd'hui également, c'est un aspect à noter dans la mesure où le constat est que les pays africains n'échangent pas assez entre eux pour pouvoir permettre de financer le développement. Aujourd'hui, les pays africains financent plus, échangent plus avec le G20 qu'avec eux-mêmes. Et même en interne, il y a une bipolarité de ces échanges-là. Donc, il y a des pays exportateurs de ressources naturelles et il y a des pays qui exportent des ressources manufacturières. Et donc, ceci fait que ces échanges-là restent relativement faibles. Néanmoins, tous ces aspects-là, c'est juste des défis. Mais en même temps, au-delà de ces défis, il est important de voir comment on peut capter des opportunités à travers ce qui est mis en œuvre dans nos pays pour mieux adresser ces défis-là. Et c'est là où parce que bon, on ne doit pas tout voir en noir. L'idée, c'est de voir comment transformer ces défis en opportunités pour permettre d'améliorer le financement. Tout à l'heure, j'ai parlé de mobilisation des recettes, des ressources internes. Et aujourd'hui, le constat, quand on regarde les tendances, on voit que dans les autres pays, il y a un plafonnement, on n'avance plus, mais en Afrique, quand même, on constate qu'il y a encore une tendance positive en termes de capacité de mobilisation des ressources. Et il est important de mettre l'accent sur cet aspect-là pour permettre de renforcer la capacité des gouvernements à mobiliser plus de ressources. Et pour cela, il est important d'élargir la base fiscale. Maintenant, élargir la base fiscale, ce sont des réformes à mettre en œuvre. Au Sénégal, aujourd'hui, il y a, avec le nouveau régime en place, il y a d'énormes efforts qui sont en train d'être faits pour améliorer cette base fiscale-là. Mais il est important d'améliorer en modernisant l'administration, mais également en dématérialisant certaines pratiques au niveau de l'administration pour permettre à l'État d'être beaucoup plus organisé et d'être beaucoup plus efficace en termes de mobilisation des ressources. Au-delà de ça, également, on a la dimension informelle de l'économie. On n'arrive pas à capter une bonne partie des acteurs qui contribuent à l'économie. On a un taux d'informalité très élevé et il est important également de voir comment permettre de mieux intégrer ces acteurs-là dans le financement de l'économie. Autre opportunité également en termes de dépenses publiques, il est important également de noter tout ce que je disais tout à l'heure, la partie sur les subventions. Il est important de renforcer la transparence et l'efficacité des investissements. Tout à l'heure, je voulais attendre d'arriver à ce niveau parce que si je prends la plateforme, le cadre d'évaluation PIMA, ce PIMA, c'est Public Investment Monitoring Assessment. J'y suis arrivé. Ce cadre d'analyse qui est mis en œuvre par le FMI a montré qu'aujourd'hui, en Afrique, il y a un déficit, il y a un écart entre ce qui est planifié au niveau institutionnel et ce qui est mis en œuvre de manière effective. Et ceci contribue à limiter l'efficacité des dépenses publiques. On perd 30% de notre capacité, de notre potentiel en infrastructure du fait de ces écarts-là. Et cela est lié, entre autres, à un problème de ciblage des investissements, d'évaluation ex ante de ces investissements, mais également d'interopérabilité entre les différentes institutions au niveau public. Et il est important donc de renforcer ce cadre-là pour permettre une meilleure efficacité de ces investissements-là. Il y a également la gestion de la dette, réduire le coût et le reprofilage, mais également la gestion des actifs passifs et particulièrement également la notation, et surtout le dialogue avec les institutions de notation. Je pense qu'à ce niveau, il y a un travail que le PNUD a fait. Depuis 2023, il y a une initiative avec le SNP pour permettre d'abord, parce que dans le cadre de ce dialogue, il faut d'abord que les pays africains puissent aller même vers ces institutions de notation-là. Parce qu'en 1994, il n'y avait que l'Afrique du Sud qui disposait, en Afrique subsaharienne, d'une notation. Bon, on est passé à 10 après. Ensuite, on est à 33, je pense. Donc, il est important, dans ce cadre de ce dialogue-là, d'amener encore plus ces pays-là vers ces institutions de notation, mais également améliorer le dialogue faire le plaidoirie, améliorer le dialogue avec ces institutions de notation, mais surtout faire la plaidoirie pour permettre d'avoir une notation beaucoup plus proche des réalités des pays africains. Et ça, il y a un travail qui est fait par le PNUD dans ce sens-là. Et en termes d'innovation financière également, il y a en termes d'opportunités qui ont été identifiées dans le cadre de cette étude. Il faut aller également, parce que si on regarde aujourd'hui sur le marché carbone, parce que l'Afrique n'est pas en tant que tel un producteur, mais il est impacté par ces émissions de CO2-là. Et donc, il y a un potentiel pour capter ces ressources au niveau du marché carbone, mais également développer les financements verts, renforcer le partenariat public-privé, mais également améliorer les instruments liés aux ODD pour permettre de mobiliser des ressources alternatives, pour permettre au gouvernement d'avoir plus de recettes et être moins dépendant de l'endettement. Enfin, il y a également la dimension intégration régionale. Aujourd'hui, on échange moins, mais depuis la mise en place de la ZLECAf, il y a un cadre quand même qui est en train de se mettre en place pour permettre à ces pays africains-là d'échanger un peu plus, mais également de permettre le déplacement beaucoup plus fluide des personnes et des biens. Parce qu'on a beaucoup de barrières, on a des barrières liées à la langue, on a des barrières liées à la monnaie qui font qu'aujourd'hui, les transactions entre les pays africains se trouvent de plus en plus compliquées. Et il faut renforcer ce cadre-là pour permettre de mieux fluidifier ces échanges-là entre ces pays. Je pense que lors du forum, cette question, il y avait un forum Invest in Sénégal qui a été organisé ici au Sénégal. Et cette question-là a été relatée. Il s'agit de comment faire même parce qu'aujourd'hui, on a plusieurs devises en Afrique et qui font que pour faire cette transaction-là, c'est compliqué puisqu'on est toujours obligé de faire appel à une devise tierce pour que la transaction puisse avaler. Donc, il est important de renforcer ce cadre-là. Et enfin, pour terminer, donc, comme piste de recommandation, il est important donc de repenser le financement pour le développement, donc sortir de cette cycle dette-aide, parce que comme je pense que la dette, ce n'est pas un instrument isolé. C'est un instrument qui est dans un cadre beaucoup plus global. Il y a beaucoup d'autres instruments qui interagissent. Et il est important donc de voir comment, à travers ces interactions-là entre ces différents instruments, comment faire pour repenser et améliorer ce cycle-là, pour sortir de ce cycle d'endettement, ce qui souvent devient de plus en plus problématique. Mais également, il y a la dimension discipline budgétaire. Donc, pour cela, également, il y a besoin de renforcer cette discipline-là et également appuyer les États à mieux mobiliser les ressources. Mieux mobiliser des ressources, d'abord par la maîtrise de l'information économique, ensuite digitaliser ou bien dématérialiser l'action publique pour pouvoir permettre une meilleure efficacité de l'action publique. Mais également diversifier les innovations financières en renforçant le cadre de financement innovant tels que les PPP, les financements verts, mais également renforcer la productivité des investissements. Et comme je disais tout à l'heure, on a un système dans lequel, dans le cadre de la mise en place des infrastructures, souvent, les institutions ne se parlent pas. Il n'y a pas cette communication qui est relativement très fluide entre les institutions et qui font que souvent, on a un problème de ciblage des dépenses. On a les ressources, mais au moins de les utiliser, on les met dans des investissements qui, en réalité, on pouvait avoir plus parce qu'on perd environ 30% de notre potentiel d'investissement du fait de l'inefficacité dans la mise en œuvre. Mais enfin, également, donc, la gouvernance, ça revient, la transparence. Je pense que c'est une problématique clé ici au Sénégal. On parle de dette cachée et il est important d'améliorer le cadre qui permet aujourd'hui de mettre tout le monde dans un même dispositif de suivi et évaluation pour qu'à in fine, on puisse mieux suivre l'action publique et également faire l'évaluation de ce qui est mis en œuvre. Et enfin, donc, pour terminer la présentation, donc, comme j'ai écrit ici en bas, il s'agit tout simplement de transformer le financement en levier de prospérité partagée, mais pour la souveraineté économique pour l'Afrique. Sur ce, je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A. And I want to open up to the audience. Fatu, is there anything you want to add on the presentation?
Maybe just about the study itself, that it's about 35 pages or so. And the presentation that we have is about 15 slides. So we actually cut it drastically so that, we can manage the time as well as convey the message. And thank you so much, Hussein, for a very good, excellent presentation, and also for working on this. It was Hussein, and there's one of our colleagues there, Ismaila, part of the team, you're working on this. And one of the key things, like he said, is on building effectiveness and efficiencies in the systems, government systems and processes. So you have these revenue leakages and expenditure leakages because we're not spending in the right places. Revenue leakages, we're not collecting as much resources. So we do talk about that, yes, but maybe start by building efficiencies in our systems in order to increase revenue mobilization and also to avoid wastage that can happen in revenue mobilization and expenditure. We saw some of the, maybe you didn't show that one on the private sector, that we had like the 10 most indebted African countries and those that are the least indebted. And we see that for the 10 most highly indebted, most of their loans are actually non-concessionary. So that is a caution, in terms of just where we borrow as well. We may need the resources, but where we borrow, because then it's a vicious circle whereby you borrow, you cannot pay, and then it affects your credit rating. So it's a vicious circle that, we need to work on. It came out there was an analysis that was done, and that it came. You've talked about the investment, targeting investment better, but maybe one point is also on trade. The impact that trade within Africa can actually do towards contributing towards sustainable development in Africa. So just those 3 points, Maggie.
Thank you to both of you for the presentation. I didn't see any hand up with you. Okay, sorry.
I think in the agenda there's someone who's supposed to make a comment. Abdusalam, Dr. Abdusalam. Yes. That's you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I actually want to thank the organizers for this brilliant meeting. And I think I'm quite impressed with this meeting. And I think it's actually timely, especially the fact that we in West Africa, we're thinking about having a monetary union as of January 2027.
I'm not sure if your mic is working.
Yeah, so I think, no, it is working. I may have to put that close to my mouth. I'm a very tall person. So I think I really want to thank you for this very brilliant presentation. I think I'm quite impressed with the quality of some of the things that I've had today. And I think I will likely go home with a lot of information to share with my colleagues in Accra. I am Director General of West African Monetary Institute in Accra, Ghana. And we think that we will likely have a monetary union, even if it's symbolic, by the 1st January 2027. And these are the issues we actually grab with. Now, let me just dwell on this paper, and I want to thank you for those figures. When you're looking at those key priorities, and I think those are the issues we're also worried about, because we need to have enough convergence before we can have a solid and sustainable monetary union. Now, my question has to do with the assumptions of where you got the $31 billion. I want to know if it's an average across the region, across Africa, or it is like you sample some countries. And I'm glad that you come up with this explanation that you paraphrase the presentation, and we've not seen the paper, so the deeper part of it would have been omitted. But I would like to just ask, what are the assumptions that flowed into that $31 billion if we change the framework around the debt management thing, which you've mentioned earlier, and that will help us to think differently. And also, most importantly, is also the recommendations I would have also loved to see more practical solutions. When you talk about like this issue of, you talked about this issue of budgetary discipline. I think that's budgetary discipline or something. That's quite important for our region. And I think that I would have want to see more practical solution in that area than generic kind of solution. Now we should go beyond the previous narratives where we keep talking about this, you know, this paraphrase kind of assumptions, I mean, recommendations. We should be more practical this time around. I mean, even coming up with a framework that we can adapt in the region. We in WAMS, in the West African Monetary Institute, we have different kinds of framework that we're working on in recent time to be able to improve our level of harmonization in preparation for the monetary union. And like you've mentioned earlier, I have a couple of points about that issues, but I think time will not allow us to go through this because this is quite important. If you look at the debt analysis, which you just mentioned now, you'll find that only 1/3 of countries in West Africa are either very close to debt stress, or they are actually trying to wiggle. Ghana is a good example. Ghana has come out in recent time with modern frameworks, and that has been some of the numbers that we are working on in the region. We think that's a good point for other countries to look at. And then we know that there are a couple of things going on right now. Commodity prices are changing. We have a lot of global unrest, and these are issues that have a very strong impact on the region. So we hope that with this kind of meeting, the outcome of a meeting like this and all that, we come up with a more stronger framework that will help to develop, to help Africa to come up from the debt crisis and also be a better country to a better region for the world to emulate from. So I want to thank you once again for that brilliant presentation, and we would love you to share the studies with us. Thank you.
There's no other question?
No, there isn't.
You talk about the assumptions.
Merci beaucoup donc, pour cette contribution et ces questions très pertinentes. Par rapport à la première question sur les hypothèses, donc on est, pour l'échantillon, déjà on a travaillé sur tous les pays de l'Afrique subsaharienne. Sur la partie analyse diagnostic macroéconomique et également sur la structure de la dette. Donc il y a un cadre, on est parti véritablement sur une base de données globale des pays de l'Afrique subsaharienne, sauf peut-être pour la question sur le crédit rating, parce que l'étude qu'on a de base sur laquelle on est parti pour faire ce diagnostic-là, c'est une étude qui a été réalisée par le bureau régional du PNUD, donc en 2023, et ça portait seulement sur 13 pays, parce que à l'époque, il n'y avait que 13 pays qui avaient une notation, donc c'est sur la base de ces 13 pays-là, donc par rapport auquel l'analyse a été faite. Et les hypothèses sont, si on part sur une notation beaucoup plus proche des réalités africaines, ça peut permettre d'améliorer la capacité de mobilisation de financement, mais également ça peut réduire le coût de ce financement-là pour ces pays africains, puisque déjà, avec la notation, on a des pays, on avait 9 pays, je pense qu'il n'y avait que le Botswana qui avait une notation positive. Tous les autres pays étaient des pays considérés comme spéculatifs. Et ceci fait que le taux d'intérêt pour accéder à cette crédit-là, c'était beaucoup plus élevé. Et si on prend en compte les réalités africaines, donc dans le cadre de cette notation-là, ça ne signifie pas que la notation, on parle plus d'une subjectivité de la notation, même si ce n'est pas une subjectivité comment dire, arbitraire, c'est que c'est véritablement une analyse faite, parce que les agents de notation, ils ont également leur base de données avec laquelle ils font leur notation. Et donc, mais si on peut améliorer cette notation-là en le rendant beaucoup plus proche de la réalité, on peut améliorer quand même la capacité de mobilisation des ressources, parce que l'Afrique devient un terrain beaucoup plus sûr pour financer, mais également le coût de la dette peut être réduit. Donc, c'est sur cette partie-là, on est véritablement parti sur une base de données des pays qui avaient une note à l'époque de la mise en œuvre de l'étude. Également, donc, sur la partie mise en œuvre de politiques beaucoup plus, je pense que je peux laisser Fatou pour répondre à cette question sur la partie.
Maybe just on the credit rating to say that one of the propositions when I look at the civil society recommendations was to have a UN framework that kind of oversee, and I think Jason did speak to that today. And just to say that what UNDP has been doing this year and last year is to put together African countries. They recently had one about 2 months ago in Cote d'Ivoire, whereby they just have in-depth discussions on credit. What are the key factors that influence the rating, and how African countries can organize themselves to even mitigate on some of those factors. So, and these are initiatives that we're working with Africa Catalyst, as well as with the African Development Bank, you know, on this initiative. So it's a collaborative effort to look at Africa. Now, on decision making, like for instance, when we talk about commitment, I know the word is a bit vague, but we do have precise things. Like for instance, procurement systems. You have procurement systems, I don't want to name countries in this, where countries that have implemented procurement systems, countries that have implemented financial management information system. And if they show you the process of procurement and how they finally get to procuring the service or the good, it's all fine. But then still there are problems. You understand, you are laughing. So you understand exactly what I'm saying. So there is lack of commitment somewhere. So it's a bit, but we can detail those things out, you know, with practical examples without indicating, even with the same thing with financial management information systems. Like for instance, even auditing or tax inspection, whereby the system can actually choose from a selected list people who can go onto your premise and do some tax inspection. You will find in some countries that that part will be not functional. So it then has to be, you call the person who is most, that you know within the team of inspectors, who will then go and do your inspection. And when it is that familiarity, obviously you then have those, corruption that does take place. So there are instances of that, good examples, practical examples, without naming countries. So when we talk about the willingness of government or commitment to implement, that's what we're saying. You can have the infrastructure there, but still it's just an infrastructure. It's how you effectively use it that will determine the impact that it will have.
Thank you, Fatou and Usman. Thank you. Maybe just to add that that was a lovely session. And just to mention, we have a session in the afternoon on sovereign debt, and again tomorrow we have a session on debt. We know how critical this is. And to reiterate what Fatou has said, we've been doing extensive work within the credit rating space, Africa Catalyst and UNDP. And as a matter of fact, we have the Credit Ratings Initiative, which if you go to Africa Catalyst's website, you'll be able to see some of the work that has been done, including UNDP, and that continues every other day. I think recently we were in Nairobi, West Africa, we were in Addis Ababa, and definitely very soon in the SADC region. Now that brings us to our lunch break, and I would like to thank everyone in the audience for your contribution and your patience. And as we head out for lunch, I would also like to request that we take a group photo here, after which we will take another one from the beautiful banner you passed. So kindly come to the stage and we do the family photo. Thanks.
Community, because